Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the Special Finance and Audit Committee meeting to order. And I'd like to firstly recognize we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nations. Our clerk today will be Ms. Sheila Gurry. The question period sign-up sheet is on the partition wall near the gallery. If during the course of the meeting anyone has a question, they write down their name and the agenda item on the sheet, and I'll call you up at the end of the meeting this morning during question period. And the first item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. We have none, Ms. Gurry, correct? A motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Councillor Thorpe, seconded Councillor Hemmons. All those in favour? Opposed? Motion carries. Motion for adoption of the minutes. We don't need to do that because we don't have any this morning. And presentations. Ms. Mercer, welcome back.
Good morning.
Finance and Audit. What a surprise seeing you here.
You guys are just going to get so excited to see us all the time. Today, we're going to go over a brief presentation on the project, the 2020-2024 draft project plan. So as we went through last month, in greater detail, today we will go over some summary points as well as anything that has changed since the last presentation we gave you on projects. And then we will go through a recap of the draft financial plan. And you will notice in your package there was a report regarding the Nanaimo Police-Based Victim Services Program, and that was a report that goes with one of the decision items in the recap, and it was requested by Council. So we've put that in here for your reference for when we get to those items to make decisions on. So I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Fulla, and she's going to go through the project plan.
Ms. Fulla, good morning.
Mayor and Council, just going to wait while they get the PowerPoint up. So as Ms. Mercer said, last month we did walk you through the preliminary project plan. So today really we just want to review the draft project plan with you, which includes a few changes. So we're going to start with just a high-level overview, and then we will walk you through the changes that occurred between the preliminary plan you saw last month and the draft project plan that is before you.
What happened to you?
So we have a project plan that's just under $293 million for the next 5 years. In 2020, we have projected spending of $52.4 million.
Councillor Martman.
I'm really apologize for interrupting. I'm just trying to understand. We're on the draft project plan, but Nanaimo Police-Based Victim Service is B.
Through to the chair, through to Councillor Martman, it will be as part of the budget recap presentation, so the second presentation. We're going to first cover off the project plan, and then we'll do a review of the draft financial plan, and at that point, that report will tie into one of the decision slides for Council.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
We're good? So looking at our 5-year project plan, over the next 5 years, we're going to spend about $67 million, or about 23% of our budget will be for transportation infrastructure. About $60 million, or 20% of the budget, will go towards water infrastructure. Now, we did see this graph here last month when we looked at it, and it just shows the breakdown by infrastructure type. And just to remind Council, when you do see that big increase for parks projects, that's tied to the waterfront walkway, because the walkway is a walkway versus a sidewalk, so it appears under parks versus transportation. So that's why you see that big jump in 2021, 2022, and then some larger increases in the future years. Another item I'd like to point out is facilities. So we have about $32 million in facilities over the next 5 years. About $13.4 million of that ties to the remaining budget for the Fire Station Number 1 rebuild. And as Mr. Groot mentioned last week, we have that condition assessment program underway. So we do anticipate, as we get new condition assessment information, that we will be adding additional projects for facilities. Because of course, the better information we have, we know better replacement times, better replacement costs, and we do expect in the future that we will need to invest more in our facilities. Looking at the funding side for our project plan, you can see the biggest percentage of our funding will come from our statutory reserves. Now, if you compared this donut chart to the one last year, you will see that statutory reserve section is bigger, and that's a reflection of our new reserve policy. So a number of reserves that we use to fund projects were changed from general reserves to statutory reserves as part of that reserve policy. So to give you some examples, we're talking about our parking reserve, our photocopier reserve, our IT reserve, as well as Council's strategic infrastructure reserve, because you do fund some projects from there, and that one is now a statutory reserve. Then we have about 16% that is debt funding. So that includes the debt for the fire station, it includes the waterfront walkway, an additional garbage truck, as well as 2 sewer projects, one that we'll be internally borrowing for and one that'll be external borrowing. And of course, what is not reflected here is the Port Theatre expansion project, because of course it's not currently in our 5-year plan as we await to hear the results of our grant application. Now, reserves are a big part of our funding source for projects. In 2020, about $40 million of the $52.4 million that we need, so about 77% of the funding for projects comes from our reserves. So that's about $2.65 million from DCC reserves and about $37.4 million from our general and statutory reserves. Now, a few other things that I'd just like to point out, and I know I've mentioned this before, but I just want to keep reinforcing the points. When we look at that 2020 closing balance, it's just over $137 million, and it seems like a lot of money. But there is a few things we need to keep in mind. Under our new reserve policy, we do have minimum target balances for a number of our reserves. In 2020, those minimum targets total $31.7 million, or about 23% of that closing balance we see there. About $45 million of that closing balance is tied to our DCC reserves, so that's about 33%. And of course, our DCC reserves can only be used for projects that are part of the DCC bylaw. And finally, one last point I'd like to make is that about 42%, or $58 million, is our sewer and water closing balances. So our sewer and water reserves, and there I'm also including our sewer and water DCC reserves. And of course, those reserves can only be used for sewer and water infrastructure. So while it does appear we have lots of money, there is a lot of restrictions on those balances and how we can use them. So I just want to remind people of that, because I know if you looked at your personal budget, you go, wow, $137 million, I'm retiring today. But when we're looking at a city and all our responsibilities and the infrastructure we have, it's not as much money as one would think.
And Ms. Full, I'm just going to take advantage of this as another teachable moment. I had a very thoughtful, I think all members of council got a very thoughtful email from someone living in the North End suggesting that we're placing too much emphasis on reserves, and we should in fact reduce the level of taxation that we might be looking at this year because we're putting too much money away. But if we didn't have this money available, it would be coming out of current income to pay for these projects as opposed to having that money in the bank.
Correct. Now, I did want to...
So we'd be looking at a significant tax increase in those years if we have some kind of a disaster, if it wasn't for this very conservative approach to financing, which is both statutorily required in many cases, and in others, the decision of this past city governments who've chosen to do it this way.
Yes.
Thank you. I hope everyone's listening.
Now, I did want to look at one particular reserve, and that is your strategic infrastructure reserve. So the projected opening balance for 2020 is just under $2.2 million. Now, what this slide doesn't reflect is you just approved $210,000 for downtown improvements recently, so that has not come off the opening balance yet. In 2020, your expected contributions to your reserve is just under $2.6 million, and that also includes projected interest earnings, because now this will be a statutory reserve, so it will earn interest. From this reserve, next year we will fund property acquisition at $600,000, and then there's where your $300,000 for unallocated pedestrian improvements comes from. And you can see that those two projects are funded every year from your reserve, As well, in 2023, we have the 900,000 towards the Wilcox Access Project. So that's just a portion of the funding for that project. That's not the entire cost. One thing that is not reflected on here is we do have that $4.6 million commitment for the Port Theatre expansion. We were looking at $4.5 million in short-term borrowing, but you also committed $100,000 from your strategic infrastructure reserve for that. So once we know the status of that, potentially another $100,000 would come out in the year that corresponded with the timing of that project. So right now,
Bonner has a question.
Sir, I'm not sure if you can answer this, but the Wilcox property, is that to tear down the trestle or?
it's, I don't know if someone, but it is for the secondary access. I don't know if Mr. Sims would like to speak further to it.
That's right. Thank you, Your Worship. This is to begin the process of designing the secondary access to the south. It's just the start of that project, and we would hope that other parties would come to the table on that as well, as far as, that's a fairly complex project. And once that secondary access is built, then the trestle can be dismantled. But meanwhile, we're limping along with that one.
And now, now that you're up, wouldn't that 900,000 come out of Public Works budgets? Particularly, I'm just trying to follow the breadcrumbs here. Not that it's going to come out of taxpayers' money regardless. I'm just surprised it's not coming out of Public Works budget.
Do you have a comment on that, Ms. Fuller?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner. So we're using a couple different funding sources from this project. Currently, it would be funded from the Community Works Fund. There is a portion of the project that would not be eligible to be funded from Community Works, and that is the portion that is being funded from Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And just one last comment here, just so you know, so the projected closing balance when we take off that $210,000 that you just allocated would leave us at about $3.66 million. Now looking at our debt, so this is similar to the slide we saw last week. Our outstanding debt at December 31st was $46.1 million. 3 of our debt issues are funded from property taxation. We fund the debt servicing on Fire Station number 4, the Cranberry Fire Hall, the Nanaimo Aquatic Center, and of course we'll be making our last payments in 2020, which I keep saying how excited we are. It's nice to pay off some debt. And then of course we have the Port of Nanaimo Center where the Vancouver Island Conference Center sits. That is funded from general taxation. Then we have 3 debt issues that have other funding sources. So Fire Station number 1, we fund that debt servicing from our General Asset Management Reserve. The sanitation borrowing for the automation of our solid waste collection system is funded from sanitation user fees. And of course, the borrowing that we did for the water treatment plant comes from water user fees. And then we also have some internal borrowing that we did last year for a DCC project, and that is being funded from sewer user rates. In our current budget, we do have some additional new borrowing. We had borrowing budgeted for the waterfront walkway. This borrowing will not happen in 2019. The sections that we were going to borrow for are currently on hold. As Mr. Rosen said, they've just finished up the feasibility study and they will be coming back to council in the next few months with a report on that. The waterfront walkway project has actually been rebudgeted in the 2020-2024 financial plan to reflect new timing. And then of course, once you get the report back from Mr. Rosen, council can make some decisions from there. And then of course, we had an automated garbage truck that we ordered this year. The truck will not arrive till the spring. So of course, we will not do the borrowing till after we receive the truck. So at year end, this project will be carried forward. And then we do have some additional internal borrowing this year as we do the construction of the Chase River Pump Station and Force Main. The new draft plan includes borrowing in all 5 years. We have the remaining borrowing for Fire Station number 1. We have the borrowing for the waterfront walkway, and this borrowing would be funded as the decision you made earlier this year from property taxation. Then we have another new garbage truck. So last year, you approved a business case for 2 new refuse collectors, one who is starting December 1st, and the other one that would start in 2022. So this is ordering the refuse truck for them to drive when they come online. And then, of course, we have some sewer DCC boring. So we're going to do external boring for one project, and that's the Millstone Trunk North. And as I mentioned last week, we are keeping an eye on our DCC revenue, and if we have sufficient funding in the DCC reserve, we will not do this external boring. So we just have to play things and see how it goes, and we'll review this each year as that project moves up in the plan. And then next year, we're doing internal boring for the Millstone Trunk South project. This chart here just shows you the projected outstanding, and here we're looking at external debt over the 5 years of the financial plan. So now I just want to walk you through the changes from the preliminary project review plan you saw last month to the draft project plan that is before you. Now, all of the changes were supported by business cases, so these will all tie back to business cases that you heard last week from the different departments when they presented their business plans. So the first change that we made was the addition of 4 electric vehicles as well as 4 dual charging stations that will be located at the Service and Resource Center. This project is being funded from the Admission Reduction Reserve. So the project itself has no impact on property taxes, but there is a slight increase to the operating budget for the operation of these vehicles, as the fleet charges and maintenance costs on the charging stations are slightly higher than the transportation allowance employees received. However, this project has many benefits to it. It's going to, of course, reduce GHGs. It also improves the professionalism. Currently now, when building inspectors show up on a job site, they're driving their personal vehicles. When they show up as a city vehicle, it clearly identifies them as city employees, as well as there's potential improvements to safety, as we could add appropriate lighting if necessary to vehicles. The second project that we added is also under the Development Approvals Department, and it is a watercourse restoration and enhancement program. So this is a 3-year program working with other community groups. In 2020, it'd be looking at the East Wellington Park back channel as well as the Millstone Estuary, and in 2021 and 2022, it'll be focused on the Millstone Estuary. And this project is funded from general taxation. Then we added a project in 2021 to replace the SCBAs. So this is a full replacement of the SCBAs for Nanaimo Fire Rescue, as well as their Cascade filling stations. And that's the picture on the right there, just in case anyone didn't know what a Cascade filling station is. This was supported by a business case. This is about a $750,000 project, but it will be funded from general capital as well as our asset management reserve, so it does not impact property taxes. Then the next one is supported by a business case as well as a council motion. And this is the design portion of the Loudon Boathouse. This project does have $15,000 in private contributions from 2 service clubs, and it will be funded, the balance will be funded from general taxation. Then we have the Bevan Park project. So we spoke about this one last week. The electrical substation at Bevan Park is original and at end of life, and we'll be doing design for it in 2020 and construction in 2021 of its replacement. Since we are doing a replacement, this is a good time to look at enhancements that we can make. So one of the changes we are going to make to the substation is to allow it for the future purchase or rental of backup generators. So currently, when Bevan Park has a power fail, we only have backup lighting. With the ability to add generators, so if we rent the generators, we could run our mechanical systems, which would allow heating, cooling, ventilation. And as you know, Bevan Park is a reception center and centrally located, so we're taking advantage here of an existing project to prepare us better for the future. And this one is funded from general taxation. Then under our business cases, we had that QP position for a traffic signal technician in the roads department in engineering and public works. As part of that position, we do need to purchase a vehicle as well as a conflict testing monitor and some other equipment for the position. So that has been added to the project plan. It's about $83,000 and it is funded from general taxation.
Councillor Armstrong.
Is that a union position?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
So that is the conclusion of the project presentation, since we did go through it in October. But of course, if council has any follow-up questions to any of the changes today or to the projects that were presented in October, I'm sure myself or the GMs can answer those.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Ms. Fulla. I just wanted to confirm that the Loudon Boathouse design, the $123,000 is the gross amount, less $15,000 from the two groups, or is it 123 plus 15?
Through the chair to Councillor Turley, the project is in the budget for $123,750, with $15,000 of that being funded from private contributions and the balance from general taxation.
Thank you.
Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Your Worship. Probably a question for Mr. Rudolph. Regarding the Loudon Boathouse, I'm in full agreement that we want to fund this, but I haven't been able to figure out what the process is whereby community groups come to us and ask to be placed in next year's budget. So it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these guys kind of got in because they came earlier, and then we had subsequent asks, and I'm wondering if there's a process that I don't understand, or whether there's something we could communicate to community groups to say, this is the process to follow.
Through Chair, Councillor Hammonds, this project, according to Mr. Harding, has been in the discussion phase for as much as 15 years. So he's got a number, he's given me a page and a half of potential candidate projects where there's been a variety of interest from different groups. And this one actually reached a stage where it was ready to come forward. So it sounds like it came up only as a result of a budget submission or a presentation this fall, but in fact it's been something in the discussion phase for quite a long time. So I think in that particular case, it's just a culmination of a lot of work over a longer period of time. In terms of others coming forward, I guess the council can receive submissions throughout the year, and then will be placed into some form of a discussion format, either through GPC or ultimately budget if it works. But in this case, it's important to remember that this was something that took place over a long time. It's got a number of stakeholders. I think you received a presentation at a GPC or Finance and Audit around it, and it showed that it's very much a community-based entity, and it's taken a long time to get to this stage. Not only for the canoe and kayaking clubs, but others. It's got washrooms that will be used by the general community and an amenity. It's just a complete enhancement for what is seen as a very beneficial community resource. But yeah, I think your question was for how do others get in the queue, and there's a long list of them that actually have had discussions, particularly with Parks and Rec Department, and those will be coming forward sequentially to you. And if anybody else has any ideas, I guess they're always open to present to council. Council is usually receive and refer back to staff for a report, and so I'm not sure if I've answered your question more than once, but.
Sort of. I completely agree that this is in the budget. I'm not contesting that whatsoever. I want to make sure that it's not our more savvy and politically aware community groups that understand how our budget works and when to talk to us to ensure that they're in the queue. And I don't know how we do that, but I've heard from another community organization that said, oh, I wish we had presented. And I don't know that we want to put it out there. If you want to be in our budget, present by this time. But it just struck me as those who have been through this before, and not just related to Parks and Rec, but any process, seem to have a better understanding of the timing of this. And in order for us to give a really comprehensive and full conversation to what we want to fund in our budget.
Mr. Harding is here, so we can see.
Good morning, the putative father.
Thank you, Your Worship, and to Councillor Hammonds. Mr. Rudolph answered quite well. The other one thing I would add, though, is like Mr. Rudolph mentioned, we're working with hundreds of community groups, many of having different stages of what they would like to see and developed. The boathouse, for example, though, was also part of a comprehensive land use plan that was approved by council, like Mr. Rudolph said, 15 years ago. In that time, with that plan, though, was that the groups would have to be quite active in the fundraising and development of it, which the plan today still has that. There's a lot of fundraising that has to go along with that. We just need the design phase so that we can get to the next level, which they can actually go out and do some fundraising, grant writing, aspects like that. So part of answer to Councillor Hemmons is that still, typically a lot of those projects have to be approved by council, even in a conceptual plan phase, if that makes sense. So example, even the BMX coming, that was probably one that was a little more out of the box, but it is part of the Bevan Park Master Plan, and identified that, you know, eventually that's going to have to get redeveloped. Where it is in the priority list, those are always the more difficult component because there's so many projects. And again, like Mr. Rudolph said, I've shown him a list of 50, 60 different projects that are out there that groups want to see.
Yeah, Your Worship, so it's important that whatever projects get supported in the context of council policy, get supported in the context of our various plans and initiatives for areas, that type of thing, so that it gives a rationalization why the city would be involved. That's the important piece of this, and some of the proponents, there's been quite a few actually and there always is, to be honest. Every year there's a number of people that have great ideas, and and the vetting of that at a staff level and report back to you is always in the context of what are our adopted plans, what's your policies, what's the budget availability, how does it fit in with our role as a municipality, all those types of things. So I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing it, but just because somebody comes forward doesn't necessarily mean that it's a green light. As you know, there's quite a few that it just doesn't really fit. So in this case, this is an example of something that's been, as Mr. Harding has indicated, a number of years in the queue, and it is aligned with the plan for the area.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. Through you to staff, I have a similar question, I think, and what's slightly different is what determines, or is there a policy that determines when a particular whether it's funding for a community group sort of becomes a line item in the budget rather than having to access the grant streams? Because I just sort of noticed there's some groups that have annual funding, and we have some asks for increasing it, but then we also have some groups that are sort of, we tell them, oh, apply for grants. So I'm wondering, is there a policy that says this is, when you meet this criteria and then and council approves, you become a line item in the budget, or is there not?
Through your worship to Councillor Brown, there really isn't a policy about how things become a line item, and that is problematic when things do become a line item because they kind of get lost in the bigger budget, and there's not any follow-up per se on accountability. So there's a few examples that we have where they've become just an automatic funding, but we haven't had a report in many years. So we're working on trying to put some context around those and make sure that there's, we would like to see like a 3 or 5 year review point on each one of those so they don't get lost. Say the Nanaimo Area Land Trust, they've been on the books for a really long time, but not a lot of, that was a political decision to put that into the books. But there is not a whole lot of history on, they provide us with financial statements, so they're still a going concern, but there's been no follow-up with council with presentations and what they've been doing and those kind of things, so we would like to see that. We're working on some type of structure around that for a policy, but that's still a work in progress at this point. So it's kind of, sometimes it's a political decision, most often is a political decision. For the Vancouver Island Symphony, they are part of the Culture Operating Grant? Culture and Heritage Operating Grant grant stream. So that is reviewed every year. So those kind of granting streams are better than just having a line item because there is a review on those. I believe they had funding, is there a 3-year funding? Yes. So there's, within that program, they're guaranteed funding for 3 years. Right. So there's those are a better process to go through because there is a review point at every 3 years in that case. But some of them that we have on the books that we do need to clean up, they're just on there and there's no review process around that. So we're trying to clean that up. So that's a long-winded answer, hopefully, to your question.
If I just may follow up, just when, and I understand you're busy, and I'm just out of curiosity, sort of, when you're reviewing things, it sort of popped up as, hey, groups might be being treated a little differently here. So I'm just wondering if, when you're saying it's being worked on, is that something that might come back for some policy discussion at a later date and staff are doing that, or is that something that if council would need to provide some direction for staff to do?
Through your worship. No, that is something that we would come back to you with. We'd put some structure around a policy and then come back to you for a comment and eventually approval.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. If I may at this point, and I don't know if we're sort of getting off topic, but I need to comment that I think both of the questions just asked were very pertinent and necessary questions to ask. In terms of the adding groups to our budget as a line item, I think I made the comment at our last Finance and Audit meeting to Mr. Rudolph that it's something that I think we need to have a discussion about policy regarding that. And I believe past practice has been that if something just keeps showing up year after year and council feels that it's worthwhile, somebody makes a suggestion and it be added as a line item. I'm not sure that's best practice, but that's sometimes the way it's happened. But I think it's very important that there is accountability and also that there is consistency in our practice. So when I looked at one of the reports upcoming, and I note, and I support the Vancouver Island Symphony, but when I see it be added to the financial plan as a line item, I was certainly going to question at that point how we make that decision when other groups are not added. So a good question, I think, and one that we certainly need to clarify. And going back to the boathouse question from Councillor Hammond's also a good question, and I'll just back up Mr. Harding because I know from my days on Parks and Recreation, Mr. Harding is dealing with, I don't know if it's hundreds, but it's certainly dozens of community groups that have projects that they want to see advanced, and they're working with him and his department. And those don't usually come to council until they are at a certain level of readiness with some funding strategy attached. So I just wanted to make comment that I think those were both very good questions to consider. Thank you.
Very good. No further questions? Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I was just waiting for everybody else there. Regarding the Loudon Boathouse, I remember last year in our budget conversation as I was learning how things work, and it was pointed out to me that anything that's operational, we put in to the budget as an ongoing cost. But these one-off items, which is the design of the boathouse, is a specific amount of money for a specific purpose, and then it's done. And we're going to be raising taxes 0.01% roughly to pay for this project, the design work, and then it's not going to be needed next year. But we'll still have raised taxes 0.1% ongoing. And it makes it easier for us to possibly reduce taxes later on because now we have 100,000 that we're not using. But I'm wondering if this particular project should be paid through our Strategic Infrastructure Fund instead.
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner. Yeah, so what this project does is it increases the amount of general taxation that goes to project funding. Yes, the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve would definitely be an option for council. We generally don't choose which projects get funded from there. We leave that to council's discretion because that is your fund to see, to support your strategic initiatives. So that is definitely something when we get to the next presentation and we look at changes that you wish to make to the budget, we could definitely have that discussion if you would like to change the funding source for that project.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Worship. I'm not sure who can answer this one, but with regard to the traffic signal technician, how is that being looked after currently and at what cost?
Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just as Ms. Fuller scrambles through the many pages of paper she has to look for the actual dollar amount, it's currently funded by general revenue for a contractor. So we have RALEC is our signal tech, so any time of day or night, if there's an issue, they respond. So this, as we move into, as you may recall from Friday, Mr. Rosen spoke about we're shifting to a software program that can manage our signals as a whole, and this needs that support of an in-house staff member. And due to the number of signals, typical municipalities would go, I've heard, as low as one signal tech per 30 signals, but we're in the 53 range, I believe. So that's kind of a real snapshot of that.
Through the chair to, I'm sorry, it was Councillor Turley? Yes. So we will be reducing contracted services when we add this position. So for example, in 2020, the position is only added starting July 1st. So for the half year, we're looking at the position will cost with related expenses about $71,000, but we will have a savings in our contracted services to help offset that of $19,000. When we move to 2021, we will be doubling that savings for our contracted services. So as Mr. Sims, I believe he mentioned, we still need the contractor to do some of the work, but we will be able to help offset the cost of the position somewhat by reducing our contractor use.
So if I could just follow up, please. So just so I understand, this position isn't designed to fully take over the job that the contractor is doing. It's to enhance it with this new software. Is that, am I understanding this correctly?
Sorry, did you say is designed to fully take over or is not designed?
Well, I'm having trouble figuring out whether the new position is going to take over from what the contractor was doing or is currently doing, or is it a case of the duties are expanded with this new software system, thereby requiring more staff time or expertise than the contractor can provide?
Right. Your Worship, the answer is yes. So both. So there will be some, as Ms. Fuller mentioned, an offsetting of the contractor's work. We won't need them as frequently or as often. But there's also the additional sort of elevation of level of service due to the complexity of the system by working with the software program. So it's a bit of both. And if, for example, we had two or three traffic signal techs, we could probably do away completely with the contractor. But I think there's a balance to be struck.
Okay.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. Through you, I think probably to Mr. Sims is a similar question, and I meant to look it up, but I forgot. But I believe last year when we were budgeting, there was a project engineer identified for this year, and then in this year's business case, it was an excluded position. And I apologize for not being present at when you presented to council last week, but I quickly reviewed the video, and it sort of sounded like, in terms of projects that we can manage, we're at capacity. So my question is, through sort of previous conversations, my understanding is that around some of these project engineering things, we do have project engineers that we fund out of operations, but we also build some of the project engineering into capital costs. Is that correct?
Your Worship, that is exactly correct. So we feel confident with the capacity we have, but the capacity that we have does include one seconded project manager, and that position is funded from capital. So we essentially add his wages, or his charge-out fees, I should say, to the capital project. So the business case that was in front of you is to switch that out, to create that as a staff position. Overall, it's a positive impact on funding, but it shifts from capital to operating. So and operating is funded from taxation. The capital can be funded, and often is, out of different funds.
If I may ask a follow-up, doing it the way that it's presently done, does that typically result in a higher expense for the taxpayer?
Could you, the first part of your question, I missed it.
So how is it presently done, using that funding a position out of capital, but it's an external consultant, or does that result in overtime and a higher cost for the taxpayer?
Your worship, not necessarily. I think it's more expensive, yes. So if we look at the gross dollar spent versus the gross dollar in, I think yes, it's slightly more expensive to use a contract position funded from capital. But funding it from capital allows us to pick it from user rates, sewer, water, and general and/or strategic infrastructure, or community works, or whatever. So I think that pure taxes, property taxes, not as much of an impact, for sure.
Okay. One more question on this topic, if I may. Looking at the amount of projects coming down the pipeline, is a additional project engineer something that's like really needed to deliver on these items? Or so I guess question I'm asking is, are we going to reach a bottleneck with capacity and we might have funding for particular projects, but we just don't have the capacity to manage them properly to completion?
It's an excellent question. I think as I say, we're confident where we're at now. I think we don't see the number of projects diminishing, and this is, as a result of, aging infrastructure and growth and a whole number of things, but we can see the projects continuing to grow. The advantage I think we saw in bringing a project engineer in-house was that the expertise remains with us, that sort of historic knowledge builds. But the flip side could be also made that, as if we have more and more projects, then it's a relatively simple matter to double the number of project engineers and, second more. So that allows that sort of scalability and flexibility as time goes on.
Great. Thank you very much.
Councillor Armstrong.
Just a question on the traffic signal technician. I heard 166,000 at the last meeting for the cost, and then you said 71,000 for, so that would be 142. So is that other figure including benefits?
Through the chair to Councillor Armstrong. So the operating costs were 71,000 plus we'll have the savings. And then in year one, we have just over $80,000 for one-time expenses. So that won't continue on. That's buying the truck, buying the conflict testing monitor and other equipment needed. So that's why we have a high cost in year one.
So that's the 166 you quoted?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, when you combine all the different elements.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Mr. Rudolph.
I just wanted to also reiterate, I guess, some of the comments from previous budget meeting in terms of these business cases. So the department's process internally is that they'll identify things that they think are justifiable in terms of getting the work done, and that is presented to the senior management team. And we had, in addition to whatever did make it through the list from our evaluation, there's another 1.6% tax increase worth of other ones which were on a fiscal basis. We've tried our best to find a way to bring that global number down. Mr. Sims, in addition to the championing the asset management process, also he had a total of 3 positions submitted, and of that, the question was, of the 3, how would you prioritize them? And this is the project. This was the one position that he felt was the most important of the 3. There is a separate funding source for the position mentioned, and so that was the way this kind of came down. You can always add it in, but then it then starts to. Are we taking something else out of budget, or are we adding it on top of the base that we've already presented to you? So it's based on trying to balance our fiscal. The other piece about this particular position is we do not have a repository of in-house corporate knowledge on something that's very fundamental to our system, which is 53 traffic signalized intersections, and to have that corporate knowledge embedded in our organization as opposed to in an outside agency is something philosophically that we feel we're at a stage where we really need this. Our infrastructure has grown, and we just feel we need to have that position and the capacity in addition to the offset from the consultant. So I hope that answers some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudolph. I think we're concluded with that section. So on to the Nanaimo Police-Based Victim Services Program. Ms. Mercer.
I'd like to declare a conflict, Your Worship, as I sit on the board.
Very good.
What we're doing here now. She went because of victim services.
Okay.
Sound and healthy, Jen.
We should clarify process.
So, Your Worship, with regards to the Nanaimo Police-Based Victim Services Program, that report was requested by council, so you had some reference to the decision point that we're going to bring up in the recap. So I would think that what we should do is go through the recap, and when we get to the police-based program, we can discuss the report at that point, if that's acceptable to you.
Yeah, so Your Worship, the idea is to do a recap and then go through each of the decision items one at a time, and there's about 7 of them. As I recall.
There's 9.
There's 9 now. So recap, go through it, then maybe come back to the recap, and then it's sort of an iterative process. So that victim services is on the list of 9. So there's 9 topics, symphony, and there's a variety of the ones that we need to go through. So it's just, that's the way we're proposing to handle it.
Unless I hear great objection, I'm going to suggest Ms. Mercer proceed then. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. So, Ms. Mercer, or Ms. Fulla, now referring to myself in the third person, it's Monday. Can I just say it's Monday? We'll go through a recap of the budget.
Councillor Bonner.
Even though it might make things go quicker, we probably should have Councillor Armstrong come back and until that point comes up in the discussion. Otherwise, she won't be involved in this other stuff.
We're going to hear the report, Councillor, but not make the decision.
Me again. So I would just like to walk you through a recap of the 2020-2024 financial plan. And then we do have, as Mr. Rudolph said, we have 9 items for discussion for council. So the plan is we'll go through the full PowerPoint, give you an overview of those 9 discussion items so that you can see them all before you start making deliberations. And then when we get to the end of the PowerPoint, we'll go back to discussion item number 1 and then give you time at that point to discuss each of the items and decide if you want to make a decision today or if you need some more time before you make that decision. So as we mentioned last week, we did get in the new rates for WorkSafe, EI, and CPP, as well as we had a couple other small changes to the budget. So that moved us from the 5.2 that was in the draft budget to 5.6. Since then, on Friday, we did review some of our other estimates. We feel comfortable increasing one of our revenue estimates, and this will have a positive impact on that property tax rate, and it will actually bring us down to a 5.5 starting rate before you start looking at your other 9 items. As well, on Friday, we got a very preliminary number for growth. We expect to have a better number next week for growth. At this time, based on the projected growth rate, we do not make any recommendations to changing from our 1.2. At this point, we are still waiting for our extended health and pension changes, what those new rates will be. We don't know that we'll have them in time for provisional. Likely they'll be incorporated for final. And at this point, we are expecting an increase for extended health rates, and we figure that based on the preliminary numbers we're seeing from growth, the extended health rate will potentially more than exceed any uptake we get from growth. So we wouldn't recommend changing growth at this time. On the user rate side, we're looking at a 4% increase for sanitary sewer user fees. And of course, that's our annual 4% increase for our asset management reserve. We have a 7.5% increase for water user fees, and of course that's our 2.5% for our asset management reserve and a 5% general increase. And as we mentioned last week, we do have a draft user rate report coming to council in the next couple of months. Following that, we would have public consultation, and our hope would be to implement the recommendations from the report for January 1st, 2021. And then on the sanitation side, we have a $1 user rate increase, moving us from 170 to 171. So the impact on the typical house, so at 5.6%, we're looking at an increase of your municipal taxes of about $117. At the new 5.5 that we're currently sitting at, you're looking at an impact of $116 approximately on the typical house. And then of course you have your increases for water fees, which will be about $42 based on 220 gallons a day, $6 for sewer, and $1 for sanitation. So an impact of, this says 166, but as I said, we're able to increase that revenue estimate, so you'd be sitting at about 165. Now, last week, I went through every budget driver line by line, so I'm not going to go through this again unless council has specific questions, but I did want to point out, so this is updated to reflect the 5.6% tax increase, and there is actually two items here I do want to talk about because they change more than any of the other line items. So the first one is wages and benefits. So you now can see we're sitting at $3.07 million for our changes in wages and benefits. So this is made up of two changes that occurred to the budget. One is those rate increases. So I talked about that we got new rates for WCB, CPP, and EI. So the WorkSafe, the impact of the WorkSafe rate change was about $340,000 to the city. The majority of that is funded through property taxation, but not all of it, because we do have employees in sewer and water funds. We have our sanitation employees that the majority of them are funded through sanitation user fees. And of course, some of our employees do work on capital projects. So it doesn't all hit property taxes, but I did want you to understand the scope of that change. CPP had an impact of just over $90,000 to the city, and the same sort of thing, some of that gets allocated out to the different funds. And EI, we actually had a very small decrease. The rate change resulted in a decrease to our benefits. The other change that appears under wages and benefits is for the provisional budget, we have removed the city solicitor position. That had an impact of just under $196,000, which brings me to the other change that I wanted to point out to you is legal fees. So when you saw these budget drivers last week, there was a decrease of $90,000, and that was because we removed that one-time funding for HR. Well, when we removed the city solicitor position and its related expenses, we did convert that budget back to legal fees. Because when we originally created the city solicitor position, we reduced legal fees to fund that position. So we increased legal fees by $213,000, so that's why the budget driver shows 123. So that takes us to our net change is just below $6 million, and that brought us to our 5.6% property tax increase. Now, as we said, we have 9 items for discussion for council. So we'll just run through each of these slides, and then we'll come back to slide number 1 for you to discuss each of them. So the first one is your strategic infrastructure reserve. So last year you made the decision to change the transition period from 4 years to 5 years as we move the Fortis Gas and Casino revenue over to your strategic infrastructure reserve. So actually in 2017, we moved over 100% of the Fortis Gas revenue, and we've been phasing that casino revenue over. So 2020 would be year 4 of that transition. So an option for council is to actually cap the annual contribution to 2019 limits. And if you went with this recommendation, when we talk about a cap, it wouldn't be a dollar amount, it'd be a percentage amount. Because both casino and Fortis revenues can vary. They can go up and down. We don't have control over those revenues. So if you wanted to cap it, our suggestion would be that it would be 100% of the Fortis revenues, because that's what the contribution was in 2019, and 67% of the casino revenues. So the impact this would have in 2020 would reduce your contribution to your strategic infrastructure reserve from just over 2.5 to just over 2.1 million. So a change of $405,000. But this would decrease property taxes by about 0.38%. And of course, if you choose to cap this, this would also impact your property tax rate in 2021. It would reduce that because we wouldn't 2021 would have been our last year of transition, so we would have taken the rest of that casino money and moved it out of funding
general expenses of the city.
Councillor Hemmons has a question.
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms. Fulla, where is it being transitioned from?
So right now, through the chair to Councillor Hemmons, right now the casino revenue helps fund general operations.
Thank you.
The second decision item
just so we're clear, it funds general operations, but I take it that council established a policy 5 years ago, basically, or 4 years ago, saying that because of the unreliability of the amount of income, that we would use it in reserve funds only and not rely on it for income purposes. Generally speaking, am I wrong in my understanding?
To the chair, the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve was created to allow council to have funding for their strategic initiatives.
It was a political decision.
I very much hesitate to use the term I'm tempted to use, and I won't use it, but let's just say it was a fund that council could respond to community interest in emergencies with, that might have a public or political appeal. That's what you're telling me politely.
Yeah, it's a fund that allows council to pursue their strategic priorities and have a funding source for that without impacting property taxes.
And that runs out in next year.
The transition period would end.
After next year, yes.
Yeah, the transition period the final amount would move over in 2021, and at that point, none of the Fortis revenue or the casino revenue we receive would help fund general operations of the city. The entire amount of those revenue streams would go to the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve, unless council chose to do something like this, which is capping the contribution.
So we're weaning ourselves off the, I won't use the term addiction to casino and Fortis gas funds. Slowly. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. Probably weaning off isn't the correct term. We're not loading us up even more. My question is, in terms of the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve, the numbers that you quoted us in the last report, those don't reflect if we were to make this 460,000 change.
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, correct. All these slides coming up, and there is 9 of them, none of them are reflected in the 5.5. Any of these changes you make will then adjust the 5.5, in this case down, or in the remaining slides potentially up, or some of them down if you removed business cases.
Thank you.
So the second...
Councillor Brown, it's taking me a minute to tap it appropriately.
Thank you, Worship. On this topic, I have a couple of questions, and so through you to Ms. Bulla. I think we had this discussion a little bit last year, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around using these two particular sources of funding for offsetting operations. Is that good practice, or is it just indifferent? There's no comment on it.
Through your worship to Councillor Brown, there is lots of municipalities use them in their general to reduce taxes. So there's no, it's not good or bad. It's just a decision that the previous council had made to put that into a reserve and use it for initiatives that council saw fit to fund.
Right.
Yeah.
And just so I'm understanding the proposal here is that the 67% number would be sort of picked to reflect that the amount isn't always the same.
That's correct. So both revenue streams fluctuate depending on the sales of Fortis gas, and then with the casino, depending on how much money the casino brought in, we get a percentage of that. So each one of those can fluctuate from year to year.
Thank you. And just one final question is, obviously there's some fairly significant funds available in this particular reserve. Would limiting the funds going into that reserve sort of have a serious impact on it to build like real infrastructure? So obviously it's unallocated money currently, but say for example if we got the Port Theatre grant, would the funds available in this particular reserve allow us to pay for our portion of that without having to increase general taxation to pay for the debt?
Through your worship, yes, that is a possibility. If that's what council chose to do, you could use that money to fund the city's portion of that project for the Port Theatre.
So I just need to move a little more specific with my question. Would the capping it at 67% to gain that 0.38%, would that impact our ability to do that?
I'll let Ms. Fulla answer it because she's got the spreadsheet next to us.
I anticipated that question. So if you did cap the revenues at the suggested levels there, that would bring your projected 2020 closing balance to about $3.2 million, 2021 to 4.5, and 2022 to just under 5.9. So depending on the timing of the Port Theatre project, because I think that's what we're discussing here, we're looking at 4.6 million, say we didn't want to do short-term borrowing, depending on the timing of that project and how it was spread out. Potentially, if we didn't, there would be room there. It would be tight. You wouldn't be funding a lot of other projects or initiatives from your strategic infrastructure reserve, but you would be avoiding short-term borrowing. So potentially, the way things stand, there is a possibility that that might be an option depending on the timing of the project. Because until we know when the grant application is approved, we can't determine the timing of construction and design. So there's some unknowns there, but I would say it's a possibility.
And if I may, one last follow-up. I appreciate your indulgence. We would always have the option of blending. So, a portion of a particular project could come from borrowing, while a particular portion of the project could come from this reserve? Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, you turned yourself off and I've cut Councillor Hemmons off. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. A couple of questions following on Councillor Brown's. Short-term borrowing would require that we pay it back over a 5-year term, so that if we didn't use any reserves, if we got the Port Theatre grant and we needed to contribute 4.6 million, we would be looking at about a 1% tax increase per year over the next 5 years, roughly.
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmons, the impact of the short-term borrowing would be 1%, not per year. It'd be 1% and likely spread out over a couple of years, because it's unlikely we would do all the borrowing in 1 year because the project wouldn't be completed in 1 year. So the total impact is about 1%, but of course it also depends on what the interest rate is at the time of the borrowing. That report was presented a year ago and interest rates do fluctuate. So it could be more than that, it could be less than that. It all depends what the rates are at the time we go to do the borrowing.
Okay, and we think we're going to hear about that grant in the spring? Do I have that correct?
We anticipate, the website says late this year. When staff have talked to people at the ministry, they've said early 2020. So hopefully in the next few months.
Okay, and now my real question, if I may. The 67%, would that mean next year we would top it up to, if we do this, next year we would go to the full 100%, or we would spread it out over the next 2 years?
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmons, my recommendation would be this would be a cap, and this is where it would remain going forward. The problem is if you then move it up next year, then you're just pushing this year's tax increase into next year's. So I think for council, it becomes a question if you feel that is sufficient funding to allow you to pursue your strategic initiatives. Okay. The other thing, this is also just a recommendation on percentages, so council could choose other percentages that potentially lower the tax increase more, or don't lower as much. You might choose that you prefer 75% and cap it there. We're just presenting one option to you.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. Going back to the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve balance, closing balance of $3,866,000, you mentioned that the closing balance would be $3,200,000?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, based on if you took this recommendation, it'd be $3.2 million in 2020, the projected closing balance.
Because you said it's $405,000, the dollar amount would be. I'm not following my math here.
So the The annual contribution would be reduced by $405,000. That has an impact also on your interest earnings, but that's minor. You also have to remember, if you're comparing that to the strategic infrastructure reserve slide in the last presentation, you have to remember you spent $210,000 from that. That's not reflected on that slide and is picked up on my slide here.
Okay. Thank you.
All the changing numbers following the bouncing ball.
For the benefit of those listening at home, and forgive me for mentioning a Griswold Christmas Vacation movie, but essentially what we're talking about here is that 4 years ago, Council chose to make casino revenues and Fortis revenues not part of the budget, basically. They were thought of as a Christmas bonus, if you will. They weren't part of the city's regular income. They would be used and set aside in a strategic fund, so if you wanted the swimming pool the Griswolds expected and wanted to have, that money would be available. And I suppose the philosophical question raised by the learned letter writer to all of us a week or two back was, if these revenues are consistent, and that's the next question I'm going to ask Ms. Fulla, if these revenues are relatively consistent, would we be better to reduce the potential annual tax increase accordingly and use these revenues as a consistent part of our general revenue? Or would we be better to continue with the policy that Council adopted some years ago, which said, let's take advantage of these funds and use them for those special projects that do arise as communities' needs and interests change? It's a very interesting question, and I'm just curious, Ms. Fulla, can you tell me potentially what the revenues have been from Casino and Fortis in the last 4 or 5 years?
To the chair. So in 2016, our Fortis revenue was about $466,000. It went up to $505,000 in 2017 and dropped to about $425,000 in 2018. So that's what we say. It's not a consistent stream. It does move up and down. When we look at casino revenue, and I'll just go back a few years, I have numbers to 2013, but I don't think I want to go back that far. 2016, we had just under 2.6 million. In 2017, just under 2.9 million, and in 2018, right around 2.9 million. And the lowest year in the few years that I have here was 2014, where it was just under 2.4. But of course, casino can fluctuate with the economy.
Councillor Bonner, thank you.
Thank you, Worship. And further to your comments there, neither one of these funds are guaranteed past a certain date. If climate action kicks in, Fortis won't be selling any more methane or propane or whatever they're selling. And so that could disappear. And the casino, not that we hope they're not going to, could very well move somewhere else, and then that would disappear the next year. So even though I don't necessarily agree with the reason it was put in there, it's probably not a bad idea that it's in there. And then we have more consistent taxation.
Lest anyone think I was encouraging a lengthy debate on this philosophical question, I simply throw it out there for the benefit of the public so they understand what Council decided to do some time. It's a conservative financial approach that personally I strongly support. There's nothing worse than being the family without any savings when disaster strikes, and one never knows what those disasters might be. Ms. Fulla, do carry on, and we'll keep you on this topic all morning.
Slide number 2. So we have the Marie Davidson Bike Park. So we did have a request from the Nanaimo BMX Association for the city to undertake the design phase of their proposed infrastructure upgrade. So this request is for $35,000. This actually would be a city project. The city would run the project for 2020. And there's 2 potential funding sources for this. One would be, of course, your strategic infrastructure reserve, and the second one would be property taxation, and it would have an approximate impact of a 0.03 increase. The third slide is our emergency medical responder training, so our EMR training for Nanaimo Fire Rescue, and this is training our firefighters in EMR. This is a 6-year program, though as Chief Fry said, if they have all the firefighters trained before that, then of course the budget would go back to its standard training budget. The impact in 2020 is $66,750 because they do have some equipment they need to buy in the first year. This would be funded from general taxation as an operating expense, and it would be a 0.06 increase. Slide number 4 was the 3-part request that you received at the Finance and Audit Committee last month from the Vancouver Island Symphony. So currently, they have a 3-year funding agreement for just over $89,000, and this comes from our Culture and Heritage operating grants. So each year, we have an allocation for Culture and Heritage operating grants. It's based on $3 per capita, and in 2020, the budget there is $305,685. So the Vancouver Island Symphony has asked that you increase their funding to $120,000 a year. So I actually have 2 bullets here because there's kind of 2 parts to this. One is they have missed the deadline to apply for an increase under the Culture and Heritage operating grant, which is how they receive the money they have now. So council could use your council contingency to fund the increase, or potentially you could fund it from general taxation. For future years, council might wish to make the recommendation to the Symphony that they apply for an increase under the Culture and Heritage operating grant, because that is actually where they receive their funding, and that's where council has allocated funds for this type of thing. The second part of the request was for $30,000 to hold the 2020 Symphony by the Sea. Now, of course, we have our downtown event grants, which can fund up to 35% of the cost. Their request based on what they were discussing for cost is more than 35%. But unfortunately, the deadline has passed for the downtown event grant funding program. So if council wishes to support this, your council contingency would be an option, or you could be looking at general revenue. And then their third request was to be added to the financial plan as a line item, and Ms. Mercer discussed some of the kind of issues with proceeding with that request. And we can discuss that further when we come back to this slide.
Councillor Hemmons has a question.
Thank you. Quickly. Did I hear you correctly that they've missed 2 applications, that there was a potential to have this funded through Culture and Heritage grant stream as well as the downtown event grant stream, and they didn't submit an application?
Through the chair to Councillor Hemmons, correct, they could have submitted a request to the Culture and Heritage operating grants for an increase to their 3-year commitment. You are eligible to apply for up to $25,000, so they are not at that $25,000 mark, so they could have applied for additional funding through there, but that deadline has passed. And then of course we have the downtown events grants. They couldn't have got $30,000 from there, but they could have received some funding for that event had they, or potentially, because we haven't picked the recipients, but potentially that would have been a funding source for them, correct?
And if I may, one more, would that be communicated to them at any point? Like if we say no to this, in theory, would we say, hey, next year, keep your eyes open for these grant streams? Is that something we do?
Ms. Mercer.
Yes, that would be something that we would communicate to them, to say these avenues are available to you for the next intake, yes.
Keeping in mind, of course, that that's a set amount of money, and there were many asks of that particular fund, of course, too.
Yes, the pros of that are we have a funding source for it, for the operating part, but the con to that is that there's less money for other organizations.
The next discussion item is the request from Nanaimo Victim Services to increase their annual operating grant. So currently they receive just over $53,000 as well as in-kind space rental. They proposed 3 possible options ranging from $50,000 for 1 additional staff member to $100,000 to allow them to add 2 additional staff members. And the property tax increase goes from 0.05 to 0.09 depending on the option, and this would be funded from general revenue, so property taxation. Slide number 6 is a request from the Nanaimo Area Land Trust. Currently, they received $30,000 a year for operations from the city. They have requested to increase that to $35,000 to match the funding they receive from the RDN. This has an impact of 0.005. I had to go to 3 decimal places, otherwise it looked like 0. Slide number 7 was the business case that council asked for staff to prepare, and this is the manager of sustainability. This would have about a 0.16% property tax increase, and of course, staff's recommendation was to defer consideration to the next financial planning cycle, as they are planning to update the Community Sustainability Action Plan next year. So based on the review and the updating of that plan, they felt it would be better to consider this position at that time. Slide number 8 is our business cases. So we did go through these the other day, but I'll just quickly recap them. So all these business cases are included in the draft plan, and of course it's at council's discretion if they wish them to remain in the draft plan or remove them. Under corporate services, we had the 2 permanent full-time prison guards. So this was actually a change in service level, adding additional guarding for Thursday night through Monday morning, which was piloted this summer successfully. Then we had conversion of those 2 part-time records clerk to full-time. So this adds 742 hours annually to the service provided by records clerks. And then we had that Bevan complex electrical substation, so allowing it for that backup generation. And I'll just leave it at that since we just talked about that in the project slide. Under development services, we had those 4 vehicles for building inspectors. This has a marginal increase to property taxes as the actual capital portion is funded from the emission reduction reserve. We had the manager of economic development that we spoke of last week. We had the $300,000 for the economic development function, so this is implementing to help start implementing the strategy. We had the QP position, the urban forestry technician, under the environment section. And then we had that watercourse restoration project that we just spoke of. Under engineering and public works, we had the traffic signal technician. And then under Nanaimo Fire Rescue, we had the SCBA replacement. This, of course, doesn't impact property taxation, but it does impact our reserve, so it's still a decision point for council. And then we had 3 business cases included under Parks, Rec and Culture, our allocations clerk, our 4-month co-op student, and the Loudon Boathouse. And when we come back to this, this would be the opportunity if someone wanted to change the funding of this to the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve. And then our final slide.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just have a quick question about the traffic control technician. I apologize. I should have asked before when we were discussing it. I'm just curious if it was looked at, similar to the building inspection vehicles, if there was a EV option that might have worked for that position that could be funded from the reduction reserve.
Mr. Sims.
Your Worship, thank you. This is a little more complex vehicle than it would need a bucket truck and would need to be a little heavier duty just to be able to get up to the signals and stuff like that.
Perfect, thanks. Just thought I'd ask the question.
And then slide 9, just to recap for you the business cases prepared that are not currently in the draft plan. We have the corporate asset management system. We have the service enhancements to dog licensing, so that was some more online functionality. And we had the emergency program coordinator under emergency management. In development services, we had the animal shelter renovation, and of course this business case is actually on hold pending the service review that we're doing so that we can come back with better information for council. We had the shift in the bylaw enforcement officer scheduling, moving them from a 35-hour to a 40-hour work week, and this also included the parking patrollers, so it wasn't all funded from property taxation because parking patrollers are funded through our parking revenue. And just to remind people, the more expenses we fund from parking revenue, the less profit that goes into our parking reserve for future new and replacement of parking infrastructure. We had the urban forestry management strategy update. We had the manager of sustainability, and we moved that to the other slide just because it was a council request, so we wanted to separate that out. Then under engineering and public works, we had the municipal services inspector and the project engineer, and under ledge services, we had the deputy city clerk. So what we thought we might do is take a short break here to give you time to absorb all that information and then come back and start at slide 1 and allow you to have some deliberations.
Councillor Armstrong.
Just 2 questions on not included cases. The bylaw enforcement, the changes in schedule, has that been through the union for agreement if that was to happen?
Sorry, I didn't hear it.
Has the union agreed to the change in the bylaw?
Mr. Horn.
Mr. Van Horn.
Yes, through the chair. For the 35 to 40 hour, that discussion actually was generated by the bylaw officers themselves, and when I first came to know about it, it came from the union president. So
Thank
it was
you.
something that they were quite supportive of.
Awesome, thank you. And my second question is, we heard a lot about the CAM system. Is that something that we really should be looking at seriously now instead of waiting? Is that like, what's the impact on city operations by not having that?
Worship, through the councillor.
This is a very large item. This is the first year of a multi-year. So there's a budget block there. There's also a number of projects in the queue right now. And also, we are hoping to have a new IT director in place early in the first quarter. So my hope was that that person would be there and make recommendations on how to balance all these initiatives. So it's totally needed, but it's just a timing issue and just having our resources lined up to lead that.
That answers my question, so it'll be for next year. Thank you.
With respect to the urban forestry management strategy update, obviously which would be tied in, I assume, with the urban forestry technician position. And I'm just wondering, how old is our urban forestry management strategy, and should we be doing that and delaying hiring the technician, or is it better to have the technician and move ahead with a strategy, or should they be in combination? Look forward to your opinion, Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Worship. So the current strategy was adopted in 2010. So it is a few years old, but from staff's perspective, there's still validity in that current plan, and we think that there is work that can be continued at least for the next year. So our priority was to bring that technician on board, which would help us with responding to the high levels we're seeing in the development. And in response to issues like I think was mentioned last week when we were talking to you about simple issues like the windstorm, which had long-term repercussions for that section. So we think the additional staff would be helpful and move forward the redevelopment of that plan until future years. And I think Mr. Holm mentioned to you last week that we have on our plate the review of a number of significant policy documents next year, and we think that this one can wait a year or two before we look at it again.
Can I ask a question?
Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Since you brought up the topic, through you to Mr. Lindsay, appreciate your comments around the timing of this. At the point that it did become recommended that by staff that strategy be developed, is there potential there to also fund it from the reduction reserve?
That's a question for you guys. Through Your Worship to Councillor Brown, the Finance Department is giving me the affirmative on that.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller.
Ms. Fuller, I think you made a gentle suggestion, notwithstanding the tyrannical nature of the agenda, which doesn't include a morning break, given that it is 10:22. Well, we did all approve the agenda. I'm going to suggest we take a 15-minute recess and return at let's be cheap. Let's 10:35. Give everybody 12 minutes if that's all right. Thank you very much. Fine suggestion. Ms. Mercer.
So we will start with slide 1, and we'll go through them, and council can deliberate on each one of those. Just to recap, the starting point is we're starting at 5.5% increase, which is 4.5% for general increase, and then 1% for asset management. And as we go through these, any changes that you make, we will do an estimated change at the end, if you so wish. So we'll start with slide number 1. So strategic infrastructure reserve. So the option on the table, or the suggestion, is capping that at the 2019 level. And we're just looking to see what council would like to do.
Councillor Armstrong and then Councillor Turley.
I just have a question as to why you picked 67%. Like, was that just, is there a reason behind it, rationale? Thank you.
Through the chair, that is what they're currently, in 2019, that is the level that they're funded at. So there was no magic number in that, it's just what they're currently being funded at.
I think we'll probably have to do that. Sorry, Ms. Mercer. Councillor Thorpe is inquiring. We're probably looking at motions on each item.
Yes, that is correct. So
direction to staff.
Direction on each slide is if you would like to take the suggestion, make changes to it, eliminate it altogether. So we'll do it one by one.
This is the painful work for which we're given the big bucks. Councillor Turley.
Yes, Your Worship, to speed things up a bit, I'd like to make the motion that we adopt the cap annual contribution at the 2019 level.
Seconded, Councillor Armstrong. Councillor Turley, do you wish to speak?
No, I just spoke to it, so it's okay.
All right, Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I was just going to ask a question to staff, if I may. In terms of calculations and everything else, would it be easier if this was a fixed amount as opposed to a percentage?
Through your worship, to Councillor Bonner, it is, because these revenues fluctuate, it's easier for us to do a percentage, because some years it's higher. For casino, for example, it's been as low as 2.4, but as high as 2.9. And depending on the activity at the casino, that amount could increase or decrease each year. So from an accounting perspective, it's easier to do it at the percentage rather than a fixed amount.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll just comment that 4 years ago, I think it was, I was opposed to setting up this infrastructure reserve, but I've come to recognize that I think it's valuable and useful, and I support its continuation. I think that capping as the recommendation that Councillor Turley is moving is reasonable, and it allows for a little bit of a reduction in proposed property taxes. So I'll support the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just with the capping, is it something, if in the future we would like to have 100% of the revenues go into the infrastructure reserve, that's something that we can do at a later date? Like, is this delaying it just by 1 year, or does this kind of set it because it has impact for the next 5 years, and then we'd have to, it would be a tax increase if we went back to putting it into 100% of the reserve?
It's through your worship. Yes, so the proposal on the table right now is we cap it, and that going forward is capped at these percentages. If you chose in 2 or 3 years to increase the casino to 100%, that would be a tax increase at that point. But that is certainly something as a council you could choose to do.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. I'm not actually in support of capping this because I might not agree with the reasons that the reserve fund was set up, but I actually think there's some wisdom in it. there's one-time expenses that emerge that I think this fund can pay for without having to increase taxes down the line. So, for example, I think the most pressing one is the Port Theatre, but there's also huge one-time expenses for, and part of it would have to raise taxes for the operations of it, but the asset management software. There's other projects, we're potentially funding several studies for infrastructure, such as the Loudon Boathouse, and I view items like that as that can be paid through this fund. So I think it gains a significant but also a relatively small tax decrease this year, but it just has to be made up for elsewhere if these things are to advance. If asset management is to advance, at some point you have to raise taxes to pay for these change in service level. Whereas having this fund from these two sources creates a pool that you can pay for these one-time expenses, and so I would support actually retaining it at 100% of both.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I'm in support of the motion just for the fact that this year we've got a relatively high already property tax increase, whereas the next following years we don't. I would like to readdress this in the following year when our taxes aren't quite as high. So for this year, I'm in favor of the reduction. Thank you.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Quick calculation of the approximately 400,000 as compared to an average combined between Fortis and the casino is about just a little over 13%. So it's, in my mind, valid to put that portion of it into general revenue, and it still doesn't impact in a huge way the amount of money we put in the reserve.
For what it's worth, my heart is with Councillor Brown, but my head tells me that given that we had, by general standards, a relatively significant tax increase last year, or during the current fiscal year, and we're looking at one next year, this year, upcoming, I'm going to support the motion. But I, like Councillor Armstrong, am of the mind that we should, from my perspective, being candid with the good people listening, that next year I want to look at it, because I think overall the concept of using a source such as these two funds and setting it aside entirely and not relying on it to pay for the groceries, but to pay for the roof repair, so to speak, I think is a highly sensible approach. And there I've gone and inspired more speakers. Oh, Councillor Hemmons, just teasing.
It was actually Councillor Gesselbach first.
Sorry, you've got to let me do this, or you're going to do it, but otherwise we're going to keep eliminating everybody. Go ahead, Councillor Gesselbach.
Thank you, Worship. No, just echoing your words there. I mean, I do agree with Councillor Brown's sentiments there. However, this year we are facing a significant tax increase, and I think that we need to do what we can to keep that number as low as possible, and then revisit how we go forward with allocating this revenue next year. Thank you.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. So I'm undecided on this. My practical mind says that we need to save for the future. That's always been my inclination, and we do have these large ticket items that we know are coming our way if we're successful. One of the things that I think people are struggling with is that last year, I believe in our budget, we identified a 3.2 tax increase, and what we're actually seeing is a 5.5. And so I'd like to just be frank about that. And the key budget drivers, really the primary drivers behind that are the police budget, which is in response to what has been, I think, the dominant narrative of our first year, and that's public safety. And the second is HR. And again, I think that's something that we all campaigned on in kind of restabilizing our resources here and supporting our staff, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't necessarily anticipate those decisions when we said it was 3.2, but I can't imagine that next year we're going to face another increase of this nature. So I'm not being very articulate, but I worry that if we don't that we're going to see another increase of this magnitude next year. But then when I think about it, what we've increased won't actually apply next year because HR will be stabilized and the police force probably we won't be adding. So that was very long-winded. I'm curious to hear what other people think. I'm really on the fence on this. My practicality says we need to save for the future and that we can handle this tax increase if next year's is as low as we predict.
Thank you, Councillor Himmons. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I'm in favor of the motion as it sits. I think that even if we take in all of the items that Councillor Brown has raised, that could almost be paid for by the amount of money that's going into the fund this year. And then we're going to have funds next year and the year after that. It's quite a large fund and it's growing and we don't have anything really earmarked for it. So I think the ability to take and cap it at a certain amount is fine. It returns the money to where it was originally being used. I'm quite in favor of having the fund. I just don't think we need to fill it up that much because we haven't spent a lot of money out of it in the past. And we don't even know what we're doing with the waterfront walkway, so that was a big chunk of it as well. So I'll be voting in favor. Thank you.
Ms. Mercer, did you want to say something?
Yes, Your Worship. Just in comment to the tax percentages for years 2 to 4 or 2 to 5, that's a starting gate. So it's not. That's where we, without adding any additional things or any increases that we don't have an estimate for, that's where we start. So if we add more positions, that number goes up. Just a comment is that in the last budget cycle, we agree, or as council, you added 15 police officers, adding 3 per year for 5 years. So next year there will be an increase for RCMP because there will be 3 additional officers being added next year as well. So it's just, and that I think maybe we need to be clearer on what those future year percentages are. It's just a starting point based on the decisions made today, how they affect the taxes in the future. So it's just that, I just wanted to make that comment.
To make reference to a term that was overused and abused, the term structural deficit, what we have is a structural increase, is what you're really saying here. And that's the baseline. And so if we want to do something that we see as important, then those percentage increases that we're looking at, we'll have to have the political courage to either increase taxes accordingly or alternatively make cuts to achieve those ends. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Worship. I understand people's positions on this, and I do see the logic behind that as well. Sort of building on what Ms. Mercer said, though, is the increase that I think we're seeing this year is the result of incremental decisions made all last year. Economic development, structural review. So I would not be confident in saying that the only way you get to a lower amount than this next year is by really being cognizant of those decisions throughout the year, because you leave yourself in a position where you have to do that increase to sort of pay for the things that you say that supporting, economic development. That's $500,000. So the structure review, very, very significant as well. So when I think about the things people want, it's not, when for all due respect, I don't mean this disrespectfully, it's not staffing at City Hall. It's new washrooms in Maffeo-Sutton. It's different types of events. It's the Loudon Boathouse. It's more bike lanes, all those sort of things. That's why I see the value. And, I agree with Councillor Turley's comments. It's already a significant amount going in there, but I see the value in retaining a reserve that is funded from not exactly consistent sources, but it is fairly consistent, to pay for the one-time expenses that go along with what people want in our city. So everyone will make the decision. I think there's no wrong decision in this, but I do think people want more infrastructure in their city.
Councillor Martin.
Thank you. I am in support of the motion. I think our infrastructure funding is healthy this year, depending on what projects come before us and the asks of the city and different groups. But I think whatever we can do, and 0.38% is 0.38%. And I'm with the same view of we revisit this next year, that this isn't necessarily going to be every year, and that maybe in future years we do put 100% into infrastructure, into the reserves. Thank you.
Any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Contrary? Councillor Brown? Motion carries. Reed Davidson Bike Park. Councillor Martin.
I'll move that we take $35,000 in 2020 for Marie Davidson Bike Park and out of the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Seconded by Councillor Hemmons. Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, I'm in favor of this. I was there a couple times this year for events, and I watched little 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds try and get out of that gate. That's a really old system. There was people from Portland, Australia, all over Canada at the event, so the $35,000 to me is a small little amount, and it's bringing a lot of tourist dollars to town, so, and it's also the safety for the young kids, and that track is really well used, so 100% in support.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I'm in support. I'll use the same argument that I used for the Barsby Skate Park, and this is, as we're dealing with a crisis of around mental health and addictions issues, this is prevention in action. This really is truly community. And if anyone is looking for an interesting night out, the BMX park there are just tons of families and tons of camaraderie and community. So full support.
I often can't resist being cheeky to council and suggesting some of you from time to time gild the lily. And I'm really going to resist, but I can't quite resist. This morning, this is for a small amount of money, so important for the community. I knew Marie Davidson. Safe to say that her work and her commitment to the community and all the young people who've engaged in healthy outdoor activities as a result of this, this particular place has a value far beyond $35,000. So unless I hear any further discussion, all those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries. Thank you very much. The next is Emergency Medical Responder, EMR training. Councillor Armstrong?
I'll move the budget, or I'll move the request for discussion, and then I'd like to speak to it.
Seconded, Councillor Thorpe, please.
For Chief Fry, we received an email today from somebody, obviously, who's a paramedic, and one of the concerns that they had is that you're really not doing the job that EMR says you'll be doing. And they're concerned about the cost factor, and then are you trying to take the place of an ambulance? So, and he says that the ambulance arrives within 1 minute of the fire department. Like myself, I have not seen that. So I'd like you to comment on that. Do you believe that the ambulance is arriving within 1 minute of your, excuse me, arrival on scenes?
Through your worship to Councillor Armstrong. So what we do recognize is that in 74% of our data that we collected over the previous 3 years, fire services arrived on scene 74% of those incidents before ambulance. And of those, the numbers, if I recollect right, they'd be in the business case. Over 45% of those calls, we were on scene at least for at least 3 minutes before ambulance, and upwards of 6 and 10 minutes beyond that as well. So we are providing a valuable service. And not only is it the service, the extra service and training that our firefighters receive, that we're not taking place of paramedics, and that's not what we're looking at doing. We're just looking at increasing the level of training for our first responders in order that they can provide better care to our community. And in the event where an ambulance isn't arriving on scene within
because of being delayed, there's only 8 cars, in my understanding, in the city. They'll be able to provide a lot better care for longer periods of time.
And just to follow up with that, and that goes to motor vehicle accidents as well, the EMR training would be applied, that would be another level of enhancement when you're first on scene in a motor vehicle accident, which quite frequently you are.
Correct. Through your worship to Councillor Armstrong, for our motor vehicle accidents and technical rescue calls and place where extrication and the scene is unsafe, our firefighters will be in there prior to paramedics arriving on scene and being able to provide better care. And again, we have been doing this on Protection Island for over 10 years, and we haven't had any instances where we have made any detriment to the care to those that part of our community, and it's definitely something that is valued by those citizens.
Thank you.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be in support of this motion, and I recall when Chief Fry's department gave a presentation on this a week or so ago, I made the comment, which I'll repeat now, that this goes to public safety, in my opinion, which should, in my opinion, be Council's top priority. And this is allowing our first responders to have a higher level of training to deal with emergency situations that they are coming across, and hopefully saving lives of our citizens. So to me, it's going to be money well spent, and I'll certainly support it.
Thank you. Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a little anecdotal information. A number of years ago, well, it's quite a few years ago now, when my mother was still alive, she would get congestive heart failure at like 3 in the morning. And of course, I was generally there pretty quickly when my dad called. The fire department generally was there first, and certainly at least 3 to 5 minutes before the ambulance got there. The only challenge was, of course, 2 things. Number one, I had no idea why they'd still have their sirens on at 3 in the morning coming down a dead-end street, but anyway, that's waking up the neighbors. But they basically were there at that time to assist in any movement of the patient, because they didn't have the training necessary. And I think in speaking to Chief Fry, the information we received is that this is an attempt to provide an additional amount of support for the ambulance. It's not to take over their position. So I'm not convinced that that's the case, and as a result, I'm in full support of it.
Thank you. Councillor Marmon.
Thank you. And I agree with Councillor Turley. That was my point, was that we're not looking at replacing anything. This is additional services. And to me, the cost of this training is low. If you save 1 life only, right? This is not that much of an investment. And I think to upgrade the skills of those in the fire rescue, this is, we're getting a great bang for our buck.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a question actually for Chief Fry. And my question is, I appreciate the emails that we're getting from ambulance services and the great work that they do. My question is, do we ever get emergency calls, be it for a fire or something like that, where it's unknown that there is actually a medical emergency as well, at which point that's not even found out until the fire department shows up, at which time they then have to call an ambulance? Or do we ever have incidents like that? Could be car accidents, whatever?
Correct, through your worship to Councillor Bonner. Our firefighters receive calls through our dispatch center, a multitude of different reasons. A lot of them are downstream from BC Ambulance. Others, we get calls directly from the community. So a lot of times they may be calling because somebody has fallen, and they think that the firefighters might be able to lift that patient back into bed, at which time we will respond to provide that service, as well as notify BC Ambulance. So sometimes the calls go back. Same as rescues or people that have fallen over an embankment. We had one last year where they fell over the seawall. One of and fractured a leg. Or rescues in some of our parks in areas like that. And again, we have a lot of fires and other types of emergencies where where we arrive on scene, and in the course of our duties in firefighting, patients will come forward or be recognized as well. And as well as our own firefighters and looking after them and each other at incidents.
Thank you.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I'm going to take the unpopular approach here, and I'm not in support of this motion. I fully believe that this training would be valuable for our community, and I attended a session at UBCM to learn more about it. However, with the current tax rate we have on the books, I'd like to see us debate this next year.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Contrary? Councillor Hemmons. Motion carries. Thank you. The next is the Van Cortlandt Symphony.
Your Worship, with
Councillor
respect, my
Turley.
wife is on the
You'll be excusing
board, so I'll
yourself.
excuse myself.
Yes. Ms. Mercer.
So we'll go through these one at a time. There are 3 requests from the symphony. And so their current funding level is 89,000, just a little over 89,000, plus they also get a $1,500 permissive tax exemption as well. So just that's what they received in 2019. And in previous years, they've received a downtown events grant occasionally. So their request here is to go from 89, just a little over 89,000 to 120. And so your options are, this could be funded partially from council contingency, or we can do general revenue. And if you chose general revenue, there'd be about a 0.03% increase. Because it's about $30,000 increase.
And can I just confirm before we go to Councillor Bonner, I believe it was Ms. Fuller said that the funding for culture and heritage operating grants amounts to $3 per citizen, or?
Yes, per capita.
Per capita.
Yep. So we have just a little over $300,000 in funding as a total.
Something to look at down the road.
Yes, because for future years, as the deadline has passed for applications for 2020, future years, we can look at funding their grant out of that grant stream. But like I said, the downside of that is there would be less money for other organizations if we chose to do that.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. This is one of the things that a policy on how we get things into our line item, I think, is very important. Had this been a line item years and years ago, like many of the other applications coming forward, we wouldn't be having this debate because they'd already have their 120,000. So my question is, they're looking for basically 39,000 more, I'm guessing. And
31.
31? Okay, 31, sorry. Is this, do we have any idea from staff when we might have this policy in front of council to review and vote on?
To be honest, I'm not, through your worship, I'm not quite sure when we'll have that in front of you. It won't be in the next couple of months, but I'm hoping mid-next year is when I'm hoping.
Yeah, and that was my question. I was hoping to have it before December or November of next year. So in theory, we could just give them the extra 31,000 out of even our strategic infrastructure fund, although don't shoot me right yet, and just delay the conversation. So we'll get them the funding they need. It'll be on the books. We won't be increasing our taxes, and next year we'll be looking at a policy that possibly would allow them to be as a line item, and many of the other organizations that we're looking at. That was just an idea to throw out there, even though the increase is not that much.
Councillor Martin.
Thank you, through the chair. How much do we have in our council? I was trying to find it, but how much do we have in council contingency?
Through your worship, for 2020, you have $100,000.
100,000.
Yes.
Yeah. it's not very much. I don't think anybody can answer this, but when the symphony could have applied for other grants, I'm a little bit disappointed that that wasn't accessed. I definitely believe in arts and culture and support the Vancouver Island Symphony, but I'm struggling with this number one. I can understand us financing something that's for the whole public when it comes into number two, the Symphony by the Sea, that anybody in Nanaimo, it's free and it's enjoyable, etc. But I'm still struggling with this very first one. Thank you.
I think in fairness, Councillor Martman, if I remember the presentation correctly, there are a number of items and programs that are delivered by the Symphony, particularly involving young people, that I believe are gratis to the public. Okay. So it's not entirely, I think Mr. Whitty referred, yes, one of the councillors suggested the term bourgeois. It's not entirely aimed at those who are generally how shall I say, generally assumed to be symphony goers. They have a much broader and more youth-oriented program as well. Unless I'm mistaken, no one's made a motion.
Nobody has yet.
Councillor Armstrong?
Oh, I was going to make the motion.
Is there a seconder?
Which one?
Oh, sorry, I'm just,
we're
number
just
one,
dealing
increase
with,
the funding to 120,000 a year.
1, 2, and 3. We're dealing
I'm
with them
just
separately.
doing one, I'd like to do the rest seriatim.
General revenue?
No, I'd like to have that discussion.
Yeah. We're going to deal with them one at a time. There were 3 separate requests. And the third one being that we add them as a line item.
Your Worship?
Question?
Ms. Gurry.
Oh, sorry, Your Worship. I just need some clarification on the motion as to whether the motion is to fund it from council contingency or out of general revenue.
Okay.
I wanted to have that discussion first before I made that, so, like, the discussion to see if we wanted where it comes from first. Otherwise, then have a second motion for where it comes from, if it passes. No, you have to pass it, and then we could have the decision.
Your
If it's
Worship,
defeated, there's no point.
through you to Councillor Armstrong, if it passes, we wouldn't know where the funding would come
Then I would make the
from.
motion for it be funded from after it passes, after discussion. That's what I'm saying. If it doesn't pass, then we don't have to worry about where it's funded from.
Yes, you could proceed that way.
All right, so the motion is that we increase the funding to $120,000 a year and the source to be determined. Is there's a seconder?
I'll second for discussion.
Councillor Martman.
My concern is where it's coming from may determine whether or not I support it. So if it's coming from council, if there was a motion that it was coming from council contingency, for instance, and we only have 100,000 there, I would not support it going from council contingency. I would support it going from general revenue. Therefore, the motion as it stands makes it difficult for me to be able to vote on it.
You could still vote against it come funding time.
Councillor Armstrong.
The reason I really struggle with this for the fact that they had opportunities to get other funds, which they didn't. However, I think about all the stuff we fund for sports and athletic activities, especially for youth and seniors. And we have very little investment, in my opinion, in the culture for youth and for seniors. I know listening to some, when I go to the seniors facilities, the people love the opportunity to go there. It's one thing that they can do. They don't really go to the arenas. They don't do that. So for that reason, I will support it. Yeah. And then discuss
the source.
The source, yeah.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I'm maybe going to earn a nickname like Tightwad Turley, but in full support of the arts and the symphony in general. I struggle, like Councillor Armstrong, with the opportunity to apply for funds that was missed. And I also just think we do $90,000 a year. We do support this organization to support those, you know, the youth and the seniors, et cetera, et cetera. And in a year when we're looking at an increase of over 5%, it's something I'd like to look at again next year.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, this is a tough one for me as well, and I certainly support the efforts of the Vancouver Island Symphony, and I'm well aware of their educational outreach in the community and their work with youth and school programs. I would not support using council contingency. I'll say that off the top. I agree with Councillor Martman. And I'm disappointed that they didn't take advantage of the grant opportunity, and I think that needs to be conveyed to the society. I would entertain supporting an increase in the funding for the coming year as a one-off, but I don't know that I can support it as an ongoing increase. Thank you.
I think in fairness, I interpret the motion to be for 1 year only, that this was not.
I did not.
Yes, Your Worship, so Councillor Armstrong just moved the current year, upcoming year 2020 to increase to 120 for 2020, and that's all you're discussing right now.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. I won't be supporting it, no matter where it comes from. There's an operating grant stream. I think if there's a question that there's not enough money there for some of this particular group, and then I think it warrants the discussion that maybe we need to have a conversation about whether that grant stream is funded appropriately, because there may be many other groups that apply to this grant stream or may want to apply for this grant stream, and so I would welcome that conversation. I welcome the sentiment of Councillor Bonner and the work that staff are already doing to develop a policy, because I think it's far too ambiguous to just sort of add it in as taxes. I think it should be wrapped up in a grant stream, and there should be clear criteria on who applies to it, for what, and then we can have that discussion as a council of whether that amount is enough for the service and program delivery that we would like to see done in our community through these groups. And I'll just raise the issues. I think that because it's listed as a potential funding source, the council contingency, when I reflect on what that fund does, I actually think it begs poor process and bad decisions. And when I look at some of the other positions that I think would be a great benefit for our staff, that I'm assuming it's probably close to 0.1, I would, and that we have a strategic infrastructure reserve that's a little bit more, has just a slightly larger barrier to pull from to pay for projects. I would actually like to see that council contingency removed completely and used to fund a position that I think would have much more benefit, whether it's a policy refresh or a project engineer, rather than some of the things that I think we've chosen and this last year and what previous councils have funded from this.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I agree with Councillor Brown on the council contingency issues, but not the symphony stuff. My understanding is that the symphony was in a 3-year application. Were they at the end of that 3 years and they had to make reapplication, or in the process during it?
So through the chair to Councillor Bonner, they are in a 3-year stream, and they're in year 2 of that, but that doesn't preclude them from coming back and increasing their ask.
Okay. And I appreciate that, but ordinarily they would not have put an application in. And had they put an application in for the extra 31,000, they would have been taken away from, had they got that extra 31,000, it would have come out of all the other people who are putting grants in.
That's correct.
So I actually applaud their doing it this way, in terms of they didn't want to take even more from the existing grant folks who are going to be getting grants. That's a vastly underfunded fund, if you ask me, and coming directly to council for the extra 31. So I would be much in favor of a one-year funding of this. Since it's a 1 year, then it should not be coming out of operating revenue. It should come out of a reserve. And then look at ways of making sure that we have people who are on the books as line items coming before the next budget.
I'm with Councillor Bonner to some extent on this, believing in the value of this, and I come back to what I recall the presentation involved, and that is there hasn't been an increase in this for some period of time. You know, music in this community, and I turn to Councillor Thorpe, who is well aware as a longtime educator in our community of the incredible value of music and the role it played in our school system. I've said before, the Diana Kralls and the Ingrid Jensens and people of that quality, Alison Crow, didn't happen overnight. They happened because this community, certainly through the education process, made a real commitment to music and the value of it. I think this is a very small amount of money for a very important part of our community. As in the presentation was emphasized, it's not just the good people of Nanaimo who enjoy the benefit of it. It's all of those people who come and stay in the hotels and stay overnight and eat in the restaurants and drink in the lounges. It's a very valuable program. You know, we'd certainly obviously be heroes for voting for number 2, Symphony by the Sea, who wouldn't love that? But the ongoing nitty-gritty, if you will, the delivery of programs that involve children, that maintain the symphony consistently, are those that they're asking funds for in item 1. So I, for one, will be supporting the request. I think, as I say, it's a very small amount of money for something that is important in our community. And music and culture, many of you have heard me say this before at previous gatherings. I pride myself in reading a lot of history, and I'm unaware of any civilization that ever collapsed because it had too much arts and culture. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Your Worship. I agree that the Vancouver Island Symphony, appreciate the work that they do. This round, I think, just with the issues around process and given what we're facing tax-wise, I won't be able to support this request. Thank you.
Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion? Contrary? Councillors Gesselbrock, Hemmens, and Brown. Motion carries.
New motion?
Yes, please, Councillor Armstrong.
Having heard the conversation around the table, before the motion, I would like to know from staff, I like what Councillor Bonner said, is there another source, like from a different reserve fund that we can use besides general revenue? Because I hear what people are saying about the contingency fund, so I wouldn't make that, it would be general revenue, but if there's another option, I'd like to know.
Through the chair to Councillor Armstrong, as it's on the table right now as a one-time funding, the 31,000 could come from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve, and that wouldn't have a tax impact. But if it's ongoing, we would not recommend it coming from reserve.
Yeah. So for the one time, I would like to make a motion that the potential, or that this funding source comes from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Second.
Seconded, Councillor Bonner. Councillor Martman, you're on the list for seconding only? Yes, okay. Councillor Hemmens.
Thank you. I'll support this motion in light of that it would be not impact taxes this year, but I do think this, again, really emphasizes the need for this policy and for this more fulsome discussion to happen, because at this point it feels like we're honestly maybe favoring those organizations who understand the process of when to come to us and what to ask for. I'm sure there are other organizations who would equally like to be considered for funding, but probably don't have the know-how or the political will or whatever to do so in time for our budget deliberations. So this feels a little loosey-goosey for my comfort, but I'm glad to see it not impact taxes.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. I won't be supporting this, and I just wanted to note that it's already, if this passes, it will be 0.66 pulled from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve. It's these little incremental decisions that do add up, sorry, it won't take long before you've met up to what you've already pulled out of it.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Contrary? Councillors Gesselbrock, Hemmens, and Brown. Motion carries. Ms. Guri.
Yes, Your Worship. So for future years, I don't know if finance requires a motion for that. Yes, I think they would like you to deal with the final bullet point then.
Item 3. Yes. Item 3 is that the Vancouver Island Symphony be added to the financial plan as a line item. If anyone's interested, sorry, second funding source, yes.
Still have to finish number 1.
All right.
So I'll make the motion, Your Worship, just to get on the table that we look at the potential funding sources for future years and then speak to it if it's seconded. Second.
Seconded?
I would like to defer this until we get our policy. I don't think we can speak to the potential funding sources till we discuss, like what was said by Councillor Brown and Councillor Bonner. I think it's something that can wait for future deliberations. So I will not support my own motion. No, I won't. I mean, I think it's important that it gets to the table so that they know that we've looked at it and discussed it. And I think for the reasons that are said by it, I think just when everyone at the table, we need the policy first before we start looking at these.
Your Worship, I wouldn't mind Ms. Fuller or Ms. Mercer just asking what actually is needed. If the motion would be to defer funding for future years until such time as a policy is in place, that would work.
Motion to defer, then I'll amend my motion if that's okay.
And Councillor Martman, friendly amendment, so to speak, although I think it's actually a new motion, so I'm going to assume that what we've really done is withdraw the first motion.
I'll withdraw the first and sit to the motion.
And make the second. Seconded, Councillor Martman. Any discussion on this deferral till we have a policy? All those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries. Thank you. Ms. Mercer.
So part 2 of this is that the Vancouver Island Symphony has asked for $30,000 in funding to do their Symphony by the Sea for 2020 only. And the potential sources, again, are council contingency or general revenue. And again, there was the intake, as Ms. Mercer had mentioned, or Ms. Fuller, we're interchangeable today. I'm talking about myself in the third person. It's awesome. That grant program stream only provides up to 35% of funding for the project, so they wouldn't have gotten their full funding for their ask. So it's up to council to decide how you would like to fund it, if you want to fund it at all.
I'm going to comment on this if no one objects strenuously. This would be enormously popular with the public. It's a wonderful event. It's a grand opportunity. But it has a political flavor to it in terms of a large entertainment, as opposed to providing the day-to-day funding that keeps the lights on and the symphony doors open, the instruments ready to play and people ready to play them. And as is noted, it would only be 35% of the project costs if there was a downtown grant, etc. So I think until we arrive at a policy around how we're funding that, I don't know that I could support the second request. Councillor Bonner, then Thorpe and Hemmons.
Thank you, Your Worship. We do have event grants available that this could qualify for. Am I correct?
Through Your Worship, yes, there is the downtown event grants, but the application deadline has passed for that, and that's the one that we have the 35% cap on the funding. I would have to defer to, I think Mr. Harding has left. If there's any other, I'm not sure if there are other avenues at this point that they could apply for 2020 at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Harding.
Your Worship, to Council Bonner, the only other grant is the cultural grant, event grant. That application deadline is also closed, and I believe that's 25,000 in that. And totally, that's the total budget for that. The other thing is, if they've talked allocations, it's also is the weekend even available? So I don't really know. As I've mentioned many times, my Field Sutton Park is booked out usually a year in advance. So I'll have to double check to make sure that that's even available.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. Recognizing that there's no motion on the floor, I don't believe at this point. I supported the earlier request, but I would not be able to support this one, partly for the reasons that I think you've already outlined. This is a very popular event, and I've always tried to attend it. But it does qualify for downtown events grants. It's too bad that they missed that, and they can certainly apply in future. I think there's opportunities for corporate sponsorship for this event as well, which I would encourage them to look at. I can't support property tax being impacted for this one event. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. Had the earlier motion not passed, I would have been in support of this, and that's because, like Councillor Martman outlined, this really is an event that opens up the symphony to the community. This is the only time that my children have attended the symphony, and the only time I imagine hundreds of the other kids who have attended, that's their only opportunity. I'm not going to vote in favor because I think these creep-ups are concerning to me, but I think in terms of community accessibility to the music programs that you referenced, this is actually a better bang for our buck than supporting the administration of the symphony. Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Gesselbrock. No.
Your Worship, there's no motion on the floor.
If we don't move it, I'll move to item 3.
Yes.
And item 3 is that the Van Crown Symphony be added to the financial plan as a line item, and I suspect in the circumstances, given our attitude, and motion to defer until such time as we have a policy, as per the previous motion.
Your Worship, we could just include this in that policy discussion about the line items. I think there's been enough talk about adding certain organization as line items that would be included in the policy, so no motions required for this one.
I am happy, unless someone objects, to follow your suggestion, Ms. Gurry, unless Councillor Bonner wants to say something.
I don't object. Only I'd like to apologize to council and staff. Had I put my glasses on, the answer to my question is right there in front of me. I'm sorry I wasted your time.
If it gives Councillor Bonner any comfort, a number of the items that were in here, I can't even read them on the big screen, so we're all in the same boat. Thank you very much. On to item 5.
Worship, I'd like to declare a conflict and will remove myself.
We'll swap in Councillor Turley for you, Councillor Armstrong.
Oh, there he comes. There he comes.
Well, it's good to know that the members of council are active in the community as well. The next is item 5, Victim Services. Ms. Mercer?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess now, the Victim Services came before the Finance and Audit Committee and asked for an increase in their staffing and gave council 3 options. Council asked us to ask staff to go back and provide a report with information. And so in your package today, you will see a report that outlines what exactly this service provides, as well as the funding that they have received over the last, I believe I put in 10 years. So what they are asking for today is for council to decide if we will fund, or if you will fund, some level of additional staff to their organization. So the funding options, because this is ongoing, and this is an ongoing operating expense, we would, the funding source would be general revenue, so general taxation, and depending on what level of funding council wishes to provide, it's an anywhere from a 0.05% increase to a 0.9%.
Councillor Gesselbrock, I think you're left over from the previous discussion. Are you on this one?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to move that council increase of 50,000 annual increase to fund 1 additional staff member through general revenue. Thank you.
Seconded, Councillor Brown. Councillor Gesselbach, do you wish to speak to it?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important service in the community. You know, I think it's deserving of 2 additional staff members. However, we do need to be mindful of our budget this year, and so I think that this is definitely a show of support. However, with modesty. Thank you.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. A question for Ms. Mercer. Last year during this process, we had Adam in the back room doing the quick calculations as we were approving, et cetera. Can we get an accurate number as it stands now?
So it's just it's not an accurate to the percentage penny, but you're looking right now at about 5.2 approximately.
Yep. Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I'm actually going to vote against this because I think we should be going with option 1. Not only has their funding not increased for a better part of 10 years, and I think it's less than what we were giving them a long, long time ago. Our population has increased and our crime rates have not decreased. So I would be much more in favor of $100,000. And my question to staff, if I may, that's $100,000 on top of the $53,000 they're already getting.
Through your worship, yes, that is correct.
Yeah, I would be in favor of increasing it to the $100,000, and since it is a line item, that it be increased by 2% each year going forward, so they don't have to keep coming back to us and asking.
Are you making an amendment?
No. Councillor Gesselbach. No, I wouldn't rule that as an amendment. I do note the report advises that a recommendation that letters be sent to the Ministry of Public Safety, Solicitor General, RDN, requesting that they increase their funding. I don't think Councillor Thorpe brought his checkbook with him today.
I think I've left it at home.
But I do want to comment on this generally. I think personally it is ridiculous that individual communities are funding this as a service. This is a service that should be available everywhere in British Columbia to anyone who's a victim of crime. You know, I appreciate that we have enormous sympathy for those who are victimized by crime, but in terms of translating it down to actual monies, it's small potatoes for the provincial government. I am going to support the motion, even though I'm tempted to suggest we defer the whole thing until such time as we see what the provincial budget is, but this is a very small organization doing amazing and important work in our community. But again, I can't emphasize enough that I think we, dependent on what the provincial government does with its budget that will be announced in the early spring, that we consider revisiting this as an item and a matter, and indicating where we stand as a community on this. And this is the kind of thing that I think would certainly be worthy of a resolution for AVICC and for the UBCM, because this is one that we actually do fund. This is, I think, a very prominent example of what amounts, in my view, to downloading. If you're a victim of crime, you're a victim of crime. It's a provincial responsibility. Councillor Gesselbach.
Thank you, Worship. I just had a comment regarding further discussion to be able to send potentially even a strongly worded letter to the province, you know, despite us funding this. Thanks.
Councillor Thorpe and Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I apologize for being out of the room when the motion was made, but I understand it's option number 3. And that was where I was looking at when I read over this information. So I will be supporting that motion. I think it's a reasonable compromise given the demands on our budgeting process this year and the obvious worthiness of this organization. So without belaboring the point, I'll support the motion.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. I'll support the motion as well. And just a point of information for Council, in 2017, the Regional District of Nanaimo put forward a resolution for increased funding for victim services, which was endorsed by UBCM. So it already is being lobbied in theory, by UBCM with the province.
This is the advantage of corporate memory. Thank you, Councillor Brown. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries. The next is the Nanaimo Area Land Trust. Ms. Mercer.
Thank you, Your Worship. I guess I should click forward. So the Nanaimo Area Land Trust has asked to have their grant increased by $5,000 from $30,000. So they would be requesting a $35,000 grant. And that would match what the regional district of Nanaimo is giving them. This again, like I had mentioned earlier, is one that has been on the books for, I think, since 2004, at which time it was a political decision to put it into the books and as a line item. And they provide us with financial statements on a regular basis. But other than that, that is the extent of.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I would like to make a motion that we increase the annual operating grant by $5,000 and add a 2% increase each year in the budget.
Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Bonner?
Sure. This one is in the line item, which is fine. And had they had the 2% increase when it was first added into our budget, they would be at $40,000 right now, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. And also, the taxpayers wouldn't be looking at a tax increase. So I think that reason we have these line items is so they can get into our operating fund, and that later down the road, we're not starving them by not increasing the amount of money they get. They have to keep coming back to us every few years. And it just makes it easier for the taxpayers as well, that just not seeing a tax increase, even though it's going to be 0.005, which is hardly anything. I think that what we want to do is make it easier for these organizations to consistently have good funding to do the work that they're doing. And if council wants to keep it as a line item, then we should be funding it each year to reflect that. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say, as usual, the smaller the amount of money, the longer the list of speakers. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Worship. NOLT has been providing very important services to the community for a long time and developed a very good relationship with the city and has moved forward a lot of environmental and conservation efforts, preserving a lot of land that's not only for conservation but recreation opportunities as well. So I think that this is a very small ask for what we're receiving, and very happy to support this. Thank you.
Councillor Emmons.
Thank you. I'm not in support of the motion. I think that we could point to any organization in the community that is maxed out, working at capacity, and if that is the only reason we're going to fund something, then that doesn't sit well with me. And I know NALT does amazing work. I'm very appreciative. However, I think part of the rationale for this coming forward was that the RDN increased their budget, and for me, that's not enough of a rationale for us to increase their budget. So it's minuscule. I understand that, but for me, it's just a point. These are things that we need that policy for. Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. I too won't be supporting this for the first reason around the process. Sort of I've argued on every one of these. But actually, I think more importantly, I think this annual operating grants funded by the RDN and funded by the City of Nanaimo is kind of interesting, because we are a significant payer of that regional district portion as well. I think this would be a lot less confusing if their annual grant just came from one body, and then they can have conversations with that one body when it might not be enough. And I also think it's an interesting relationship where we're providing some operational funding, but then there's also very unique asks to help out with purchases and that sort of thing. So I think this particular organization does great work, but it could benefit from a more wholesome discussion on where NALT is funded from and what that relationship looks like moving forward.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. There's several components to this for me, and I take Councillor Brown's point, and certainly NALT and other organizations, can I say, benefit from being able to appeal to both the regional district and the city of Nanaimo for funding. I support the work that Nanaimo Area Land Trust does, of course, and I recognize that and I value it. The other thing that complicates this request or this motion for me is Councillor Bonner's addendum about the 2% increase each year. I would be willing to support $5,000 for the coming year, but in terms of consistency, I don't believe we have a 2% rise built into other grant funding, and so I would question whether I would support doing it for this. Now, maybe I can be corrected by staff. Ms. Fulla or Ms. Mercer or whoever is there.
Through the chair.
Councillor Fuller?
Yeah. Certain operating agreements, there is a 2% or a percentage increase in their agreement, but for the most part, no. The 2% isn't added. There are some, like I say, operating agreements, but generally there's not a 2% increase to anything.
Thank you. And so for that reason of consistency, I won't be able to support the motion as it stands. Thank you.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I too cannot support the motion the way it stands for one very simple reason. They didn't ask for the 2%, so why are we offering it to them?
Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, I concur. The 2% has an issue for me. And the other thing I would like to say, if we do support it, I would like to have a yearly report. I know that some of us at the RDN do hear what they're doing and others are, but you know, a lot of people in the community never hear what they're doing. And you know, I know it is a very relatively small investment, but I think it's important that we get those yearly reports. And I think that'll be something when the policy review is done as well. Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would be interested in having an amendment to take off the 2%. It would be my hope that this type of annual granting would also be looked at when we do look at the policy that we're hoping will come to us before next budget. So if anybody wants to make an amendment, or can I do that myself?
Or Your Worship, you can just friendly amend it if the seconder is in agreement with you on that.
Yes.
In agreement?
Yep.
So we're back to the basic motion, which is $5,000 a year increase in the operating grant. All right. Anything further, Councillor Bonner?
No, I just didn't want to see my tiny motion for $5,000 get defeated.
Whoever thought compassion would be sand in the gearbox. Councillor Martin.
Thank you. And now that Councillor Bonner, they've made the friendly amendment, then I will be able to support the 5,000, but I do believe that this is something we should look at in the future as a policy around those organizations that receive funding year after year, and we should look at our policy. Thank you.
Councillor Gesselbrock.
Mine was just to move the amendment to take.
Councillor Turley.
So, Your Worship, I just want to clarify something here. The motion is 5,000 a year. Does that mean each and every year from here on, that's an extra 5,000?
No. Increasing it from 30 to 35,000. It'll be 35,000 year after year after year.
That's what I was hoping for.
Well, we wouldn't want you to be inconsistent with your reputation. Councillor Hemmons, having used your title in vain in your absence. I just want to comment on this. I'm one of those people who likes value for money. My personal view is, why would you pay $40 for a bottle of wine when you can buy 2 perfectly acceptable bottles of wine for $20 each? The value for money that this community receives from NALT is amazing. The reason council so long ago decided to fund them was because of their value to the community and their continued work with staff to ensure that significant parcels of land that are of importance inside the city of Nanaimo, outside the city of Nanaimo, are in fact preserved. It is a line item in the budget, and they haven't asked for an increase for years. Indeed, when we look at the proposed tax increases that are, I'll call them structural increases now, that may become my favorite phrase, the structural increases alone would be more than 2% potentially in most years. I would have happily voted for the motion with the 2% increase, because I, again, think that the work that is done, the value to the community, and particularly given that we've declared the climate emergency, that the work that NALT does in ensuring that forested areas and other areas are preserved that contribute to the sequestering of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, I just think is so important. So I'm not going to go on at length unless anyone is inspired, or I won't use the term inspired, there's probably another term that's more neutral, by anything I've said and wants to say something, encouraged, whatever, then I'm going to call for the vote. The motion is to increase the annual operating grant by $5,000 per annum. All those in favor? Contrary? Councillor Hemmons, Councillor Brown, thank you very much. Motion carries. Item 7.
Just my opinion.
I think we've determined where the bottom line is today by my discussion of wine. Manager of Sustainability, Ms. Mercer. Councillor Martman, I think, is anxious to move a motion, but I'm going to let you say a couple of words first.
Okay, thank you, Your Worship. This was the Manager of Sustainability, as Ms. Fuller had mentioned earlier, was a business case that was put forward at the request of Council. And the impact on the 2020 property taxes, if Council chose to include it, is 0.16%. However, staff are recommending that you defer consideration until the next cycle budget to allow for the review and updating of the community's sustainable action plan. So that is what is on the table at the moment.
So staff has recommended we don't hire the captain for the ship until we know what the destination is.
Or the ship.
Councillor Martman.
Thank you. I'd like to move the staff recommendation to defer consideration of this position until the 2021-25 financial plan to allow for the review and updating of the community sustainability action plan.
And Councillor Armstrong, you're on the list to second it. Councillor Martman, do you wish to speak to it?
I think it speaks to itself. It just makes sense, and yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will not be supporting this motion. I think when we look at how we've reached our targets as a province for greenhouse gas emissions, as a municipality, I think we're continually undershooting, and this is an issue that I think that we need a lot more hands on deck. I really appreciate the interest and mobilization and the work that the city has already done on these files. It's wonderful having all the directors present at the Environment Committee as we go through and looking at these issues. However, I do think in general as a society, movement on this file is undervalued. Declaring a climate emergency in April, there was funding available to engage in the Sustainability Action Plan and get a consultant to review that back in April. Now 8 months has gone by, and now we're looking at the sustainability refresh at this moment. And that plan probably won't be done for another year. And so I think the level of urgency there's quite not aligned where I'm feeling it. However, I do understand that I don't have the same level of operational knowledge and how everything fits together, so I do have to defer to staff's expertise. We have a economic development manager that has already been budgeted for without a plan, a strategy established, and so I think just taking this moment to take stock and reflecting on our priorities is important. However, yeah, thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, Your Worship. I think it's great. We'll be considering it next year. I think that's where this will land. But I too feel that I need to express that the sense of urgency around this topic just isn't there. And I don't think at this council table, I don't think in this organization, nor do I think in the greater society as a whole. I think it's interesting that we don't have an economics strategy in place, but we're willing to fund that function with a significant increase and also hire a manager. So that logic doesn't necessarily hold for me on this. And I agree with everything Councillor Gesselbrock is. Every month that goes by just makes it harder and harder, and larger gains need to be made in a shorter period of time. I don't think people are kidding when they say the level of mobilization on this topic needs to be on par with what's sort of known as war efforts. And we're like barely nibbling around the edges. So I think as a whole, I'm just sort of generally dissatisfied with society's approach to sort of willingness to tackle this problem. And I think largely that just has to do with cognitive dissonance. So on principle, I won't be supporting the deferral, but I imagine that's where we'll be considering it next year.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I'm in favor of the motion for the simple fact that I believe that everything our staff is doing is with a sustainability and an environmental lens. So I feel very confident that, I mean, they just looked at 4 EV vehicles instead of our normal trucks or whatever. So I think they're doing a lot on that, and I think it can wait the year because, I have faith that I know that the majority of our staff that are sitting here are very much involved in global climate change and whatever, and are watching all the trends. They're constantly monitoring that. So I feel very confident that we're not going to miss out on a lot by waiting for the year for next year's position. So I'll be in support of the motion for those reasons.
I'm compelled to respond to the remarks of Councillors Gesselbrock and Brown. And from a philosophical perspective and consistency, we shouldn't be deferring this based on the declaration of the climate emergency. On the other hand, I think Councillor Martman and Councillor Armstrong have pointed out something that I think we perhaps don't give enough credit to either our staff or the community in general about the changing attitudes. I wake up some mornings and feel just as dismal about the future of the world as everyone else around this council table. But the fact that we're all elected here, I think in and of itself, given the people who we are and what we said during the campaign, reflects a pretty firm commitment in this community. I think the work that staff is doing every day, bringing it in without the necessity of direction because they're intelligent and able to do so, gives me great comfort when I see school children come from Cedar and speak to us, when I listen to my grandchildren, as I get to every day, unlike some less lucky grandparents, and what they have to say and the attitudes they reflect and the things they talk about and the practices themselves that they engage in. I am not without optimism. And so I don't believe that the position itself, in and of itself, will advance the cause that's already being undertaken by so many of the staff. And that's not to say I don't believe we shouldn't have the position. I think it's important and it sends an important message to the community. But I'm a little more optimistic than my fellow councillors, and I hope that I'm right and they're wrong, but time is telling all of us very carefully which of us will be more accurate. Mr. Rudolph and then Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to remind Council that on the economic development front, there was a fairly detailed review undertaken with a lot of stakeholders throughout this year, which led to a recommendation in the budget. The newly established Environment Committee affords the same review opportunity in a detailed way to furnish a set of recommendations, perhaps for next that would be in front of council for next year. So I think that review process is just staggered a little bit differently. So I think the Environment Committee is the place where that detailed review is going to take place, and you may yield a number of recommendations just as the same as the Task Force on Health and Housing. So I wouldn't feel too dismayed if this doesn't get forward, because you have a lot of chance to unpack the work that's there and raise the bar with your recommendations.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to remind Council that as co-chair of the Economic Development Committee, we've not met yet, and yes, there's the items in the budget, but that doesn't necessarily mean that items in the budget are going to be spent. So I think that those two comments were a little premature. Thank you.
Any further discussion? All those in support of the motion? Contrary? Councillors Kesselbrock, Brown, and Bonner opposed. Motion carries. Number 8, business cases included in draft plan. Ms. Mercer.
Thank you, Your Worship. So Ms. Fuller has gone through the list a few times. If council wishes to discuss any of the items on this slide or the next one, and let us know what your thoughts are of, would be removing them at this point, or your other comments on it.
Councillor Brown?
Yes, Your Worship. Unless staff advise me this is not possible, and then I would like to move that the Loudon, sorry, where did I have it here? The Loudon Boathouse design be funded from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Second.
That the Loudon Boathouse design be funded from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Oh, okay.
And I could quickly speak to that. It's just a 0.1% that just doesn't need to come out of general taxation, in my opinion.
Ms. Mercer. I think Councillor Brown was asking if there's any reason not to.
No, it's a one-time cost. It's not an operating cost. It's certainly something that, as a council, you can do.
Oh, did you need a seconder?
No, we've got a seconder in Councillor Bonner. Any discussion? Councillor Hemmons.
I'm in support, I think. Keeping it down makes sense.
Well, you're not going against the tide this time. All those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries. Thank you very much. Anything further in the business cases included in draft plan? Councillor Bonner?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm wondering regarding the traffic signal technician, not so much the person themselves, but the vehicle that we're going to be buying. We're increasing our taxes to pay for something that's a one-off as well. And I was wondering if there's any other funds that we purchase vehicles out of that we can utilize for this.
Ms. Fuller.
Through the chair to Councillor Brown, no, the other source that we do use for funding vehicles is our equipment depreciation fund, but that is for the replacement of existing fleet vehicles because our existing fleet contributes to that reserve for their future replacement. So when we expand the fleet, you are looking at a different source of funding for that.
Councillor Bonner, another question? You're looking rather reflective. As you always do.
Well, it wouldn't be a replacement. I'm just wondering if we have other bucket trucks that we're going to be replacing that we could just move up a bit.
Ms. Mercer.
Through your worship. So the manager of fleet looks at all of the options available, and maybe Mr. Sims can comment more on this, but that is something that they would look at to see if something can be repurposed. There is also an annual fleet charge that will impact operating as well, so that would have to come from general revenue. But I didn't know, Mr. Sims, do you want to?
Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think it's a really good question, but I think I would say, in further what Ms. Mercer said, our fleet manager, Mr. Evans, generally tries to optimize the life of the vehicle rather than sort of replacing on a set interval. And there's sort of this constant review of service records and all that sort of stuff. And there's a point where you throw good money after bad when it's, of course, makes sense. There's also some vehicles that we may not get a lot of use out of, so that we would retire early to receive some income. But I can't think of off the top of my head we can certainly look at it and see if there's any other options to, but off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any.
Any further discussion on the business cases included in the draft plan? We don't have to vote on these. They're included. They're part of the budget. And for what it's worth, we will come to business cases not included in the draft plan, and I'm certainly satisfied that, based on what we heard earlier, that the urban forestry technician is a worthwhile position to have, but that we can defer the urban forestry management strategy update. All right, if nothing further under 8, final call on to item 9, business cases not included in draft plan. Ms. Mercer.
Thank you, Your Worship. So yes, as Ms. Fuller has gone through this list already, these are items that have not been included in the plan. So if there was any ones that council wished to include, now would be the time to have that discussion. Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I apologize for coughing. I didn't know it automatically turned on when I hit my button. So.
It's November. Everyone's entitled to cough a little bit.
I'm not prepared to pass a motion yet, but I would like to raise a point of conversation. Spending some time thinking about this week, I think these business cases not included in the draft plan, if I'm understanding Mr. Rudolph correctly, are because staff identified the highest priority and are trying to sort of take a responsible fiscal approach and a lens in which to view that, and I really much appreciate that. Sort of over the last year and in the last budget, did hear that there is additional capacity for some project engineering, and that we could eventually, ideally, pull that out of some of the capital projects, pros and cons of that. And I also have heard, and I think I've heard two things. Is one that council load in terms of sort of what we're doing with governance and where we're going, and the increase in committees does have its impact on the legislative services, and I think those are all good changes. And part of what I've heard from Mr. Rudolph, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is there's sort of a policy refresh that might need to be undertaken to review some of our policies, and I know ongoing questions around bylaw. All those things take capacity. So I noticed that if we were to reduce our council contingency to 0, so it's $100,000, we have the strategic infrastructure reserve that more or less functions the same. And I do think, reflecting on the last year, the council contingency, like I said, sort of begs bad process and poor decisions ultimately. And sorry, Richard, but just looking at the budget, the co-op student for parks, if you were to collapse the council contingency, you could potentially afford one of the two without a tax increase of the deputy city clerk, manager of legislative services, or project engineer. I think either or would add capacity in departments that would benefit from that, and we would really see some of that impact at the council table. So I put that out there for conversation purposes and consideration.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Bonner.
Well, Councillor Brown just took everything I was going to say, but he said it probably a lot better than I would have, so whatever he said, I'm fine with.
Well, Councillor Armstrong.
I agree a lot with what was said. One of the concerns I have, and I guess if we could take it from the infrastructure, like in previous years, we had a poll like 40,000 here for added security, et cetera. So if that can be pulled from the infrastructure fund, which I don't see why it couldn't, I agree. Putting that 100,000 would be good. I do want to also bring up one other thing, and that's the change in the bylaw enforcement officer schedule. We have like basically a crisis downtown in those areas, and I think that's those added 5 hours to 8 different people would be very beneficial for the community. So for me, I would like to see that possibly looked at. I know it's partially funded from parking reviews, and the union's in favor of it, so there wouldn't be any union issues. So I just think it's a step that might help alleviate, not that it's going to do a lot, but it could help alleviate some of the issues that we're facing downtown if we increase the hours. Thank you.
Councillor Cheerly.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question was with regard to the bylaw officers as well, and the question is that inclusive of the parking bylaw officers or just the bylaw officers? And the reason I'm asking is there potential for more revenue and parking revenue if it includes the parking? Because I think there's more than 8 total.
Through the chair to Councillor Thorpe. Yes, that includes our parking.
Early.
It's okay,
Sorry.
he's happy about
I was
that.
looking at
I don't know.
It's catchy what Ms. Mercer has. I can't remember names now. Yes, it does include our parking patrollers. At this time, there was no anticipation that parking revenues would increase from the additional hours.
Okay.
But it does include the parking patrollers.
Councillor, you finished? Yes, thank you. Sorry. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I agree that the council contingency begs bad decisions. And I just want to be really clear that those are our decisions. That's right? And if we then go from a $100,000 pot of money with which to make bad decisions to a $2.5 million pot of money using that same rationale, we're in trouble, right? So I think we just need to make better decisions.
I just want to jump in and ask a question, if I may, before I follow the rather interesting and stimulating remarks of Councillor Hemmons. The $100,000, what historically has that been used for? Can you give me some concrete examples, or maybe Councillor Thorpe or Armstrong can assist, because I don't have a corporate memory of this. So.
Right, so we're talking the 100,000 council contingency.
Yes.
Generally, that has been funded when by items where people have come up to the podium and asked or gave a presentation. In recent history, we've done, I think,
Maybe.
Yeah, we've done SPCA. We've given some money to the SPCA for their SNP program. We have MIBI, the MIBI grant. So it's usually one-off things that council's been presented with an option to fund, and it's random. Some years the money is all spent, some years only a small portion of it is, depending on who has an ask that year. So that's generally the type of funding that comes from that 100.
Thank you. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. I think the conversation we're having here is less of having the fund or not funding, is how do we fund that pot of money. Right now, it's funded out of general taxes. So if we were to not fund it out of general taxes and keep the 100,000, our taxes would go down 0.1%. So some of the other options possibly for funding this fund, and I realize it's there because it's a little bit easier on staff. So if somebody comes forward and they want $9,000 for whatever, and we give it to them, we don't have to redo our budget, which is what we would have to do if we pulled it out of a reserve, and the bylaws and everything else associated with it. But I also understand that's pushing money around and just, everybody going like this. So the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve, we quite able to make bad decisions on that anytime we want, right, Councillor? So I think I think what we'd like to do is look at something that we don't particularly look at, is our surpluses. And surpluses are only there if you have a surplus, but we consistently always have surpluses. And one of the ideas is things that are nice to have, which could be a council contingency fund, could be funded from surpluses. And if we don't have a surplus this year, then council doesn't have a contingency fund next year. So, and this is, again, these are money that taxpayers have given us, and by taking the money that they've given us and we haven't spent, or we've increased our revenues and we therefore have a surplus, we should be looking at these nice to have things as things that get funded out of grant surpluses. And that could include granting for events, right? You have a certain amount, say $70,000 a year, and if we have a surplus, it gets another $30,000, things along those lines. But the taxpayers don't have to pay for them through tax increases. So I think that the contingency fund could be paid for through surpluses, and at the very least could be funded through the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve.
Thank you, Councillor Bonner. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple of random thoughts on all of this. So first of all, to surplus, yes, we usually have a slight surplus, but in my opinion, it's minimal, given that we cannot run a deficit, and I think staff does an excellent job of keeping us pretty close to the fiscal line there, so any surplus is unpredictable. I like the idea of having a council contingency fund, and it has been useful in past when semi-emergent issues have come forward, and I can think of several examples where we've used it to fund something that we thought was worthwhile that we hadn't counted on. And I agree with Councillor Hemmons that we have to simply make good decisions and be careful how we spend the money. But I like the idea of having it available. I don't think it has to be a large amount, but I don't think $100,000 as a contingency is a large amount. So I would not support not having that fund. And to Councillor Armstrong's earlier point regarding bylaw enforcement officers, that is something that I would consider. I do appreciate that staff have been very conservative in the business cases they have put forward to be included in our budget, and these are all worthwhile things, and we can't get everything all at once. And on this list that we're looking at right now, I think if I was going to support anything being added to our budget, it would be regarding bylaw enforcement. That's just my thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thanks, Your Worship. I just wanted to clarify that I don't necessarily think the decisions weren't worth making. I just think when you have this slush fund that people can come up to the podium and present, it creates a sort of a scenario that it probably isn't ideal for the best decision-making processes. Sometimes, maybe they aren't great decisions, but hindsight's always 20/20, right? So in the time, you know, I have voted for things, and you say, oh, a couple months later, maybe that wasn't, where I'd land today, but you always have updated information in the future. So I see a couple things here. I will be honest, I very much believe that there's a great deal of work organizationally that the Deputy City Clerk Manager position could support, and that the organization and the council would benefit from. But I think that I'm not going to propose that on adding to the tax increase, because anything I'm trying to keep it neutral or lower. There is the option, I think, to reduce the council contingency fund by 50% to fund the change in bylaw enforcement officers without increasing taxes as well. So if there's an idea to hold on to a contingency for those one-offs and maybe reduce it to it's quite a lower amount, that I think that option was there, and I would actually support that reduction to add the bylaw enforcement officer change in schedule.
Ms. Mercer, we have one item left after this, the draft financial plan recap. How long do you think that will take? Just a matter of a few minutes, because we're supposed to finish here at 12:30. We have to eat, and then it's 1 o'clock on to governance and priorities.
So, Your Worship, that's what the recap is what we're doing right now. Okay. So whenever we finish with this will be the end of the session today.
You're right. Sorry, I must have dozed off. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I would like to propose that we look at increasing or change the bylaw enforcement officer's change in schedule, where it's partially funded from parking revenues and the remainder from the council contingency fund.
Second. Your Worship, can I speak? Mr. Rudolph, you can always speak.
I just wanted to say that we're having a public safety workshop this afternoon, and you may come out of that with a little more information around the bylaw officers and that type of thing. You may come out of that with some thoughts and recommendations that would inform a decision around that piece a little better than this morning. The second comment I was going to make was on this discretionary account of $100,000. It's a relatively small amount of your overall budget, which confines the discretionary element of what you do to a relatively small budget item, as opposed to a strategic fund or surplus, which is a much larger pool of money, which could be then used for more short-term kind of initiatives and opportunities, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just, so there may be a need to revisit the whole subject of having a contingency relative to some of these other things. That's perhaps a bigger discussion than today, but you do have the option of eliminating it, which would save something, or deferring it to a conversation at a finance and audit in the next year, or I guess I'm not sure what other options there are for you, but it is a fairly fundamental conversation you're having, and it does involve a couple of potential candidate pools of money for different things that are not necessarily specifically in our plan for next year. So, but I just wanted to remind you, public safety this afternoon, bylaw officers, the whole function will be in front of you. We'll spend a fair amount of time talking about parks and the whole function. So, and we are coming back yet again with another conversation on funding and budget next Monday. And you will have that plus the 4 final readings or the 3 readings mid-December. So there's further opportunity to inform yourselves around some of these items before you firm it totally up.
Your Worship, in light of that, very reasonable. I would like to withdraw that motion, and then we can look at it next Monday, because it does make sense to get the fulsome picture this afternoon if the seconder is in agreement to withdraw.
Done.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thank you. Councillor Gesselbrock?
Oh, no.
That was on that item, so to speak. Councillor Martman?
Thank you, through the chair. I just had a question. Is there anything that in the council contingency that we could not spend from the infrastructure reserve?
Through your worship, no, they're generally whatever you could fund with the 100,000 you could fund from your strategic reserve.
Thank you.
Well, and here I thought we hadn't concluded business cases not included in the draft plan, or we're already found where the real money is. Oh, this is good. Just teasing. I just want to go back specifically, though. Are there any other items or comments related to the business cases not included in the draft plan? Ms. Mercer, where are we at? What's the total?
Your worship, you're currently at 5.1% approximately.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's better than where we started this morning. Councillor Himmons.
Thank you. A clarifying question for Councillor Brown going into Monday's conversation. You said reducing our council contingency by 15%. Do you mean every year going forward, having 85,000, or just this 1 year, funding it through?
Councillor Brown.
If I may, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Hemmons and the rest of Council, I just think it's interesting that you have a strategic infrastructure reserve with a set amount of dollars, and then you create this little $100,000 pool to pull from. It's very odd to, I think, create this little two slush funds of varying degrees, so I think it begs a look at of, one, do you find a way to collapse those in together and just have a set process? Or if you have this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the 100,000 is different because it doesn't come from the casino revenue or the Fortis revenue, it just comes from general taxation every year.
Yes, through the worship to Councillor Brown. So yes, the strategic infrastructure reserve is not funded from general taxation. It's the casino and Fortis, whereas council contingency is from general taxation. They're just different pots of money for very similar things.
Right, so when I'm thinking about this thing, I'm thinking, well, strategic infrastructure reserve is great for those projects, those one-offs, and it comes from a place of funding that isn't from general taxation. Where I think about this council contingency, where it's just set up so you can say yes to people at the podium, when you already have a source that you could do that from. I think it begs a look at saying, can we use that general taxation amount from the requisition that goes to our taxpayers in better service to the city and its operations? And I think the answer is yes.
I was going to say that someone's slush fund might be somebody else's emergency or rainy day fund too. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I agree with everything Councillor Brown said, with the caveat being that as long as we're making good decisions, because that is access to a larger pot, a much larger pot of money, there's a much higher risk. However, my understanding from Councillor Bonner is that if we, say someone comes with a $9,000 ask, then do we have to redo our bylaw for the budget? Like, what paperwork does that generate?
And through your worship to Councillor Hemmons, yes, we would have to do a bylaw amendment, but what we do generally is do it a few times a year, come to council with a bylaw amendment a couple of times a year, so we accumulate any of the changes and then come to you with a bylaw amendment. So it is a paper, it's a background administrative.
Is it onerous, or is it, sorry to put you on the spot, but really what is this going to look like? I'll let you.
To the chair, to Councillor Hemmons, it's a little more work than, say, if we did a budget transfer from council contingency, but not a significant amount of work, not enough that it should impact your decision.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Armstrong.
I'm just wondering if we could put this as a topic for a GPC. I think it's a really good topic to have, and I think it needs fulsome discussion. Instead of taking up all our budget time on it, I think it'd be a really good GPC topic.
I'm going to hear Councillor Brown on this.
If I may, I think we would be having a GPC on a topic of $100,000. And I get what you're saying. I just think finance and audit and budgeting is the place to actually have that conversation. And what sort of put me onto this is if we think about people that come to the podium and they make an ask, it might be a really legitimate ask, and it might be money well spent. However, when I think about $1,000 or $100,000 annually requested, and then there's a whole series of business cases that are backed up by corporate knowledge and a business case that supports those, I'm much more inclined to spend the $100,000 on those to advance the business of the city.
I want to thank Councillor Brown for raising this, frankly.
Really
I think,
good point.
and Councillor Hemmons' comments in particular, for the two of them, for making us focus on these issues. Councillor Armstrong? Sorry? Mr. Rudolph.
It's possible to revisit this next week as we refine our numbers and you give it some reflection. You're at 5.1% right now. That's where you currently sit. So if you want to reflect, you will have a chance before you get a draft piece before you for bylaw in mid-December. It's something to reflect on, and you will have a chance to, whether you wanted to delete that item as something you could contemplate as a motion maybe at next week, or change any of the decisions you made today for that matter.
Reasonable? Anything further? I don't think anyone signed the question period sheet, have they, Ms. Gurry?
There's no questions.
No questions. Thank you very much, each and every one of you, for your contributions this morning. I think this has been a most useful meeting and expressed a wide range of views, and very intelligently, if I do say so. Motion for adjournment. Councillor Turley, seconded Councillor Bonner. All those in favor, motion carries. Thank you.